I've always been looked at as a nice kid, the patient, timid, caring guy. And I would like to believe all of that to be true. But honestly, a lot of that could also be due to the fact that I've never had a lot of confidence. I'm 18 years old now, and this lack of confidence has given me a lot of problems throughout my life so far. It's like the other kids at school can sense it. Kids can be so cruel. When I was younger, I suffered a lot. I can distinctly remember when I first began dreading having to go to school. It was in 2nd grade. There was a kid named Ricky in my grade. He was the poor kid at school. His family didn't have any money. His clothes were always outdated and usually pretty dirty. They were most certainly hand-me-downs or obtained from a thrift store. His hair was unkempt and desperately needed cut. Even as an 8-year-old, I felt real sympathy for this kid. But like I said, kids can be so cruel. Because of Ricky's unfortunate home life, he instantly became a target to the other kids. Most of the bullying Ricky received came in the form of generic insults from some of the other kids. They made fun of his clothes, said his family didn't own a bathtub, came up with various crazy stories why Ricky's parents were poor. It went on and on. It always bothered me a bit. I didn't like seeing someone else being picked on. I knew it hurt his feelings. My family life wasn't exactly perfect. My dad died in an accident when I was only a year old. I have an older brother, Rob, who is 4 years older than me, so we were never at the same school at the same time, but we were still close. Then there was my mom. She was loving and hardworking. She didn't have a great job, and our family struggled too, but she always got what Rob and I needed. She kept us in new clothes and fed us well. She gave us a decent place to live with some decent things in it. She was always our rock, and she somehow made it work. But I knew what it was like to basically have the bare minimum. We weren't all that much better off than Ricky and his family. But even more than that, I could see what the bullying did to him. Once a vibrant and playful kid in kindergarten, was now withdrawn only 2 years later. He really didn't have any friends. At this point, now in 2nd grade, people were beginning to form groups, or cliques, and he wasn't part of any of them. But if that wasn't bad enough, the other kids had to go out of their way to torment him. At this point, I get it. Kids are insecure. They're looking for the approval of their peers. They are trying to impress them. They are trying to be the cool kids that the other ones look up to. But it almost always comes back to them not feeling good enough about themselves to begin with. Of course, as kids, none of us knew this. Everyone seemed to think the bullies were the cool kids. They were the funny kids, the ones with power, the leaders. But in reality, they were none of those things. If only kids knew what they were doing. If only they knew what kind of damage bullying had on other kids. I mean this nicely, but kids are just kind of stupid. I'm about to graduate, and looking back, we were just kind of dumb and naive to what the real world was. Things eventually only got worse for Ricky. He would always sit alone during lunch at school, as there were always several unused tables. No one would ever allow him to eat lunch with them. I would have, but some of the kids I sat with at lunch, that I once considered to be my friends, would not have allowed it. No one wanted to be labeled as his friend. Eventually the jokes aimed at Ricky turned into taunting from across the halls and lunchroom. It continued to evolve. Kids then began throwing things at Ricky during lunch. He would just do his best to ignore them. One day, one of the main bullies, John, walked up to Ricky during lunch, picked up his chocolate milk, and dumped it right on his head. Ricky went home early that day. Ricky knew he couldn't retaliate. It was practically him against the world. Or at least it must have felt like that to him at the time. Another day, while Ricky was eating his lunch, John did something else. This really upset me. I knew Ricky didn't eat enough due to his situation at home. Sometimes he would just sit during lunch with his head down, eating nothing at all. One day, he pulled a small brown sack out of his old, dirty-looking book bag. As he began to unravel the brown bag, John came up behind him, grabbed the bag from his hands, started smashing what was inside of it with his hands, and threw it in the trash. All Ricky did was get up and run out of the cafeteria. My heart sank and I felt genuine sadness for him. I quietly snuck out of the cafeteria and began to look for him. After a couple minutes of searching, I eventually found him sitting in one of the stalls of the boys' bathroom at the far end of the school. "Hey Ricky, it's Mark," I said apprehensively. I could hear him in the stall, crying quietly to himself. He didn't reply. I was looking down at his old, tattered shoes. I began to think about how old those shoes were. Who else previously owned those shoes? Where they've been and what they've seen. I came back into reality of the situation and walked closer to the stall he was in. I wasn't sure what to do. I just wanted to somehow make him feel better. Make him feel that someone, anyone, cared about him. I also brought him my sandwich and a pack of cookies which weren't open yet. I could afford to skip a meal, and I thought it would probably be a better meal than he's had lately. Once I was standing in front of the stall he was in, I asked him, "Ricky, is it okay if I come in?" Again, he didn't reply to me. Although I've never done anything to him personally, he probably didn't trust me. I'm sure at this point, he didn't trust any of the kids at school. I pushed lightly on the door to check if it was locked. It pushed open slightly. I then opened it far enough so I could peek my head in. Ricky was just sitting there on the toilet, with his head in his hands, lightly crying. Once he could sense I was standing in front of him, he began wiping his face with his sleeves. He didn't look up, but finally, he let out a weak, I'm fine. I just want to be alone." I told him, "Okay, Ricky, but just take this." I handed him the food. After a few seconds, he took it out of my hands. It was at that point that he finally slowly looked up at me. He had a look of both confusion and surprise. I'm sure part of him had to feel that I could possibly be playing some type of terrible joke on him, but I think he was able to sense the sincerity of the gesture. Giving him the food actually made me feel even more sad than I previously was. I could tell by his reaction to the event that it was incredibly rare for someone to do something kind for him. I began to wonder what his home life was really like, but quickly got the thoughts out of my mind. I gave him a sympathetic smile and walked out, respecting his wishes. It was that day, at that moment, that I really began to understand and appreciate the severity of Ricky's situation. Time continued forward, and not to my surprise, the bullies continued to torment Ricky. I was definitely not one of the cool kids. I was one of those kids that just kind of flew under the radar. Not a complete nerd, but also not popular by any means. So there was really nothing I could do to help Ricky out. I didn't have any influence over the bullies. They barely even knew I existed. Things just got worse and worse. I walked around with a sense of guilt and remorse for what the poor kid was going through every day. One day, I walked into school in the morning, and after going through the doors and rounding the corner, I saw Ricky. He was walking by himself. About 1 second after seeing him, I then saw John. I resented that kid. He was a little taller than most boys our age. He played sports and was great at all of them. He was decent looking and his parents were well off, but all of that wasn't good enough for him. No, he still felt the need to be a bully. Instead of using all of the many, many gifts he was given in life to help or inspire others, he decided he would torment others for his own pleasure. Ricky was minding his own business, walking with his head down. As soon as I spotted John, it was too late. Ricky never even saw it coming. John blindsided him out of nowhere, practically tackling him into the lockers. Ricky hit into the lockers with a startling force. He immediately went down into the fetal position and covered his head with his hands. John and his friends, all laughing, ran off to avoid getting in trouble. Not that the golden child John could actually get into trouble. He had the best facade I've ever seen, convincing all the teachers he was such a sweet boy. Regardless, he was good at sports and his parents had money. Either of those, or especially both, are the formula for getting through school easy, regardless of your behavior. It's pretty sad how true that actually is. And these days, school officials talk about how serious of an issue bullying is, and yet, nothing seems to ever change. Always raising awareness, never taking action. I ran up to Ricky to check on him. I knelt down next to him and put my hand on his back. He jumped a bit as soon as I touched him, but I assured him it was me and that he was safe now. I sat there with him for a minute. I asked him if he was okay. He just shook his head yes. Eventually he stood up and just walked off to go about his business, as if nothing happened. For some reason, that angered me more than anything. How in the world is it okay that someone completely innocent can be treated in such a way, and then just have to walk off and accept it? He never did anything wrong to them. He didn't instigate anything. He was given a bad hand in life. He should have been helped out by the other students because of it, not tortured. He might be willing to accept what happened to him, but I wasn't. I decided I had to take action. I didn't care what possible backlash there might be. I was going to the principal, and I was telling them everything. I knew that John was going to get in a lot of trouble, and he deserved it. I walked into the main office at school. The receptionist was on the phone. She signaled me to wait by looking up at me and putting her index finger up. The bell rang, and I heard students scuffling down the hallway, trying to make it to class on time. But not me. I had to help Ricky out of this situation he was in. Finally, the receptionist asked me what I needed. I told her it was urgent that I talk to the principal. She asked why, and I told her it was private. Why did she need to know anyway? Reluctantly, she told me to take a seat and she would let him know I was there. I sat there, reminding myself of every incident of John and his friends bullying Ricky. I wasn't going to forget to mention anything. Finally, I was called back and sat before the principal. "Mr. Adams, what urgent matter brings you in today?" he said. He didn't seem to have a lot of genuine interest in his voice, but he would once I told him everything that had been going on. I put it all out there, everything. I made sure not to miss any part of it. His reply simply blew me away. "Listen, Mark," he said. "This is a tough age for you guys. I know that. I was a kid too one day, believe it or not." His light chuckle began to make my blood boil. I knew where this was going. He continued, "You kids have a hard enough time at this age just trying to fit in. Everyone has their own personality, and not all of them are going to be compatible. Of course, we discourage roughhousing, but it's going to happen. Like they say, boys will be boys." I replied by telling him this wasn't just some sort of roughhousing. This was targeted assault. But every time I tried to speak, he interjected. Everything I said, he passed it off one way or another. He eventually told me I needed to get to class. I tried to continue, but again, he stopped me. He told me he wrote the time on my pass, and I better not get to class long after that time. I was absolutely shocked. This is right where I began to lose faith in humanity. This man before me, a principal of a school, was just informed of some extreme bullying, things that were beyond bullying, and he just blew it off as nothing. He wouldn't protect Ricky either. Remember when I said that schools raise awareness for bullying but fail to take action? Well, this is when I first began to learn of this. I slowly stood up, speechless, and walked out of the office to my first class that day. The next couple of days, things continued on the same. Honestly, at this point, I just tried to avoid both Ricky and John. I didn't want to be a part of it. I tried to help. I did my part. I was done with all of it. That attitude lasted all of about 2 days, possibly 3. And then I found myself close to Ricky one day during recess. It was a relatively warm spring day. I was playing with some other kids, running around, going down the slide, and toppling on top of each other. I was having a lot of fun. Unfortunately, that fun didn't last. It was abruptly interrupted by no other than John. Ricky was sitting on a bench by himself, minding his own business. That was typically his usual behavior when we went outside for recess. It had snowed several days prior, but today was quite warm, and basically all of the snow had melted. It created a decent amount of mud, but all the wood chips in the play area provided us with somewhere to play without getting too dirty. John came over with his friends and began picking on Ricky. He talked about how all of the other kids were complaining about how Ricky smelled, and that he needed a bath. He said that a giant mud pile nearby was cleaner than Ricky in his clothes, and that he was going to give him a bath. Ricky stood up and began to walk away, but it was no use. John, being quite larger than Ricky, grabbed him and began dragging him in the direction of the mud pile. Ricky did his best to resist, but he was overpowered. Ricky said nothing during all of this. He just did his best to get away. At one point, Ricky slid out of the jacket that John had a grip on and started to run, but he was immediately tripped to the ground by one of John's friends. They all laughed, and at this point, John's friends began helping him restrain and carry Ricky. I felt helpless, once again watching an awful event unfold in front of my eyes. I quickly spun around looking for a teacher or a janitor, anyone, but no one was in sight. Once they managed to inch their way over to the puddle, John and his friend Luke began to position him. Luke was one of John's best friends. When you saw one of them, you usually saw the other. Luke wasn't really talented at sports or anything, but he was huge. He was kind of your stereotypical bully-looking kid. Tall, fat, an idiot, etc. And at this age, he was able to play sports alongside John simply due to his size. With the two of them combined, it was more than easy for them to control Ricky like a rag doll. Luke grabbed both of Ricky's feet, while John grabbed his hands. They lifted him up and began swinging him back and forth. They began counting together out loud. 1, 2, 3. I couldn't believe it. With everything they've already done to this poor kid, they kept managing to do things even worse and worse. There was an outburst of laughter from all the students outside. Despite how mean it was, all of the kids just couldn't help themselves. Ricky slowly stood up. He was covered in mud from head to toe. The sadness I felt inside intensified, but it was quickly overran by rage. The next thing I knew, I walked up to John and shoved him. I said, "How would you feel if you had to walk in his shoes for a day? How would you like it if someone did all these things to you?" John just looked at me in complete surprise. Like I said, he barely knew I existed, and suddenly I was in his face. I also believe he didn't know what it was like to have someone stand up to him. I stormed off in a rage, as everyone stood around, speechless at my actions. I didn't see Ricky anymore that day. Obviously, he had no choice but to go home. It was probably actually a relief for him. Things changed for me that day, in more ways than one. I felt like I was reborn at the young age of 8 with a new outlook on life. And also, I managed to put a giant target on my back. I knew that I would be in trouble, and that John and his goons might mess with me, but at the time, I didn't care. I was just so angry. As days passed, I did end up on the receiving end of some bullying. The things John did were pretty minor though. He would pass by me in the hall saying things like, "Everyone watch out! Ricky's boyfriend's coming!" He sure thought he was funny. And of course his friends would always laugh along in approval. Ricky finally came back to school. As I was getting ready to pass by him in the hall, he actually stopped and spoke to me. He grabbed me gently on the shoulder. I turned to face him, and after a moment he said, "Thank you," and then walked off. That small gesture of appreciation was enough to keep me motivated. I did something that took little effort and it impacted someone in a positive way. I decided from then on, I was going to try to help Ricky. If we stuck together, maybe neither of us would be bullied anymore. That day at lunch, I went over and sat down across from Ricky, who of course was sitting at his own table. He looked up at me in surprise and then said, "Would you like to hang out this weekend?" I was taken back by this, as we'd barely ever talked up until this point. I hesitated for a moment and then said, Yeah, why not? I'll ask my mom if it's okay for you to come over this weekend." I specifically mentioned us hanging out at my house, as I would be quite nervous to go to his place. I had always wondered what kind of things went on there. I saw his eyes light up a bit. The wave of depression that he always wore on his face finally seemed to lessen. Only slightly, but it was something. I will admit, I felt uncertain about hanging out with him, but I figured he couldn't be too bad. Maybe he would be a little depressing to be around, but it would be worth a shot if it helped him. When I asked my mom about it later that night, she seemed happy at the idea of me having a friend come over. I spent most weekends by myself as I didn't have any close friends, and my brother was always busy with one of his own friends. Ricky and I planned it out with our parents. On Friday, he would ride the bus home with me. He would stay the night, and his parents would pick him up Saturday morning. The end of the week finally arrived, and before I knew it, Ricky and I were on our way to my house for a sleepover. Once we got to my house, he turned into a completely different person. He didn't seem so timid. I think it was maybe due to the fact he felt safe for once. He was talkative and actually pretty funny. We got to know each other and had a lot in common. He was excited about having pop to drink and snacks to eat. We played video games. Although he wasn't very good, he loved it. He said his parents told him he didn't need to play video games and therefore never got him a gaming system. Although I kind of thought it also had a lot to do with their financial state as well. From that point on, Ricky and I became friends. And eventually, best friends. We continued to get bullied, but we stuck together and it wasn't too bad. We hung out nearly every weekend for the next couple years. That joy and faith in humanity came back to me. By the time we were 12 and in 6th grade, it felt like we had been best friends for our entire lives. Ricky was definitely still an unusual person. He was kind of dorky looking, and the dingy, often misfitting clothes didn't help either. But he didn't seem to care about it, so neither did I. We had each other. One day at school, just as things seemed to be going perfectly, there was an incident. While in gym class, Ricky and I were messing around, playing some dumb game with a soccer ball, trying to kick it back and forth to each other while trying to catch it. When it was Ricky's turn, he kicked it hard towards me, but his foot must have gotten it at a weird angle as it sharply veered off course, and in a stroke of bad luck, the ball hit none other than John, right in the face. We both looked over immediately in a bit of panic. John yelled, "Who the hell did that?" He looked over the direction the ball came from and saw Ricky. He touched his nose and saw the blood on his hand. As he began to walk off towards the bathroom, he pointed at Ricky. "You! I'm going to get you!" he said. And he did. Because from that point on, it was like 2nd grade all over again. The name calling, the shoving, the tormenting. It was an everyday occurrence. I stayed by Ricky's side as much as possible, just like he stayed by mine. We did everything we could to avoid John, but all too often we would run into him and have something happen. For years now, I hated going to school, and now it was even worse. I had allowed myself to become all too accustomed to the bullying. I finally realized this. I'd become just like Ricky. That poor boy that I felt so bad about. The boy I tried to protect. I was him. How did I let this happen? I began to feel the rage and resentment rise in me once again. It was getting towards the end of the school year. One morning, I called Ricky to see if he wanted my mom to pick him up on our way to school, which was the normal routine most of the time, but I only spoke to his mom. Ricky was in bed with a fever. I felt disappointed and really didn't want to go to school without him, but I knew I just had to rough it out. The school year was almost over. I knew I could make it. That day, we went outside for recess. I wandered off by myself for a bit and decided I would catch up on some homework. Before I knew it, I heard, "Hey fag, where's your girlfriend?" I didn't have to look up to know it was John talking to me. He was there with Luke and this other kid, Carrie. I began to ignore him, but he was persistent. They inched closer and the insults continued. Within seconds, I couldn't hear a word coming out of his mouth. All I could think about was the fact that I was the bullied kid now. All these years, and he just can't let it go. The rage grew inside of me, to a level I had yet to experience in my life. I began to shake, and my heart began to practically beat out of my chest. I felt my entire body was swelling up. I began to get hot and breathe heavily, and then I just snapped. I finally looked up at John. He was still saying something. I saw the smirks on all their faces, and the adrenaline took over. I charged at John with every bit of force I could create. The impact of me spearing him into his midsection head first was jolting, and we both went to the ground hard. I could hear him gasping for air, and I knew I knocked the wind out of him. I was on top of him as he laid on his back. I immediately positioned myself up and started throwing punch after punch. His friends seemed to just be in shock. As I beat on John's face, they were just saying things like, "Hey man, stop it. What are you doing, man? Get off him." I could hear the apprehension when they spoke. They didn't know what to do. I finally had some rational thoughts enter my mind. We had drawn the attention of almost everyone outside at this point. I really didn't want to get into trouble. I was so close to the end of the school year. I finally got up and John just laid there. I put my fist up and motioned towards Luke and Carrie. "Do you guys want some too?" I said. They clearly didn't, and both took a couple steps back from me. "Leave me alone or you guys are next." Okay, they said. I looked around. Those who at one point ran up shouting, "Fight, fight, fight!" now stood there in amazement. I'm sure they all expected to see me getting pummeled when they got closer to the fight, but it was quite the contrary. Everyone started talking to each other, expressing their surprise. I knew with all the students crowding around us, a teacher would be over soon to investigate what was going on. Just then, the bell rang, and everyone began to disperse and head into class. Still breathing heavily, I went and sat in my next class. It was not even 5 minutes into class when there was a page over the loudspeaker. "Mark Adams, please report to the principal's office." I instantly got butterflies, while all the students around me looked, saying, "Aww." I knew I was in trouble. I got up and started to slowly walk to the door, which at this point my teacher was pointing at, indicating time for me to go. I began to think about what I could say or how I could get out of this. Crap, did I actually hurt John? I knew I hit him several times, but I'm not some big, dangerous person. In fact, this is the first time I've even been in a fight. I got more and more nervous with every step I took towards the principal's office. With a great deal of apprehension, I managed to force myself to enter the office. The principal's door was open. When he saw me, he stood up and gestured for me to come in. "Have a seat, Mark," he said as he shut the door. He sat down in front of me and just stared at me for several moments. "John is on his way to the hospital," he said. "Do you have anything to say about that?" My mind began to race. I could barely keep track of the thoughts that flowed in and out. Is he okay?" I asked. "Well, he has a broken nose, a chipped tooth, and a black eye. And that's what we know of as of now. So no, Mark, I'm gonna say he's not okay." I've never heard Mr. Lacey talk in this angry of a tone. To be honest, it scared me, and it left me not knowing what to say. "What the hell happened out there?" I don't know, Mr. Lacey. I just lost control." "You lost control?" "There is a boy on the way to the hospital. This is serious, Mark. Tell me what happened." "Well," I said, "I was just outside minding my own business. John, Luke, and Carrie approached me. They started calling me names. They started saying all of these horrible things. I tried to ignore it like I usually do. I guess all of my built-up frustration finally came out. I really don't know, Mr. Lacey. I don't." He sighed loudly. "Listen, Mark, you're lucky his parents don't want to press charges. And that's only because they said John has been in your position before, and they know these things happen. Not everyone is going to be so understanding. I really didn't expect this out of you. Not you, Mark. Look, if you have an issue with John, or anyone else for that matter, you need to walk away from them, not react with violence. At first I was planning on expelling you, but the only reason I'm not is because you've never been in trouble in the past. I am suspending you for 5 days though, and you will make up all that schoolwork when you come back, and you should feel thrilled about it. Any more trouble from you, anything at all, and I will enforce that expulsion. You are on thin ice. Go get yourself cleaned up and go back to class. Your suspension begins tomorrow." I was not pleased with what I was just told. If the world was fair, people would realize John got what he deserved. My mom was going to flip out on me, but I didn't want any more trouble, and I knew pleading my case to Mr. Lacey wouldn't help anyway. "Thank you, Mr. Lacey," I said. "I promise there won't be any more trouble." I stood up and walked out of the class. When I got home from school that day, I felt a sense of dread. I had to explain to my mom why I wouldn't have school the next 5 days. I walked in, and my mom was standing in the living room with her arms crossed. She turned around and looked at me. I knew immediately that my principal must have already called her. She was visibly upset. "I talked to your principal earlier," she said. I just hung my head down and waited for the outburst, but to my surprise, it didn't come. I could tell she was upset, and her voice sounded more stern than normal, but she didn't do so much as even scream at me. Of course she told me my behavior was unacceptable, and that I could never again put my hands on someone in violence unless it was self-defense, but she said we would get it sorted out, whatever that meant. I was relieved though. Now I'll be honest, part of me was also excited to be able to tell Ricky and my brother about what happened. I knew my brother would be proud, and Ricky, well, he wouldn't be anything short of elated. The next week went by quick. Although it was a punishment, it felt more like a short vacation, and I wasn't worried about getting caught up on my schoolwork. I was always a good student. When I came back to school, I didn't know what to expect. Part of me was very nervous. I knew that a retaliation was possible, and without all that rage and adrenaline, John could take me out anytime he pleased. I didn't end up running into him until after second period ended. I was walking down the hall, and I saw he and his friends coming down from the opposite way. John did indeed have a black eye like the principal said. He also had some type of white bandage across his nose. His skin looked purple around his nose. I got butterflies in my stomach. Once I realized I was staring at them, and they were also looking at me, I decided I had to keep looking. I needed to look confident. John's friends continued to stare me down as they walked by, but John just stared at the ground. He didn't even acknowledge me, and from that point on, I was free again. The bullying stopped. I once again returned to being that happy, nice guy. Eventually, Ricky and I found ourselves in high school. I had made a couple other casual friends, but still spent most of my time with Ricky. Ricky never really made any other friends. Even the friends I had just really didn't take to him. I'll admit, he didn't come off as a very appealing person to befriend. He was pretty weird and dorky looking. He still dressed in weird clothes that were far from stylish, but he was my best friend, and I didn't care about any of that. Once we were high school age, we obviously started to gain interest in girls. I would talk to girls at my school every so often, but never really started up anything with them. Ricky often talked about various girls at school that he found interest in, but even with my encouragement, he said there was no way he would ever go talk to any of them. There was one girl he became very fond of over time, and really, I wish he hadn't. Her name was Emma. He first mentioned her when we were in junior high school. Over the following years, his infatuation continued to grow. He would write love letters to her, but never had any real intention to give them to her, and always ended up destroying them. He also wrote poems about her and drew pictures of her, but just like the letters, they met the same fate. When he began secretly taking her picture at school, I'll admit it creeped me out a bit, but at the time, I figured it was harmless and he was just in love. When we got to our senior year of high school, Ricky began talking just a little bit differently about her. He told me that once we graduated, he would probably never see her again, and he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in regret, wondering what if. It was getting closer and closer to the end of our last year of high school. I told him the worst that could happen is that she would say no, and if she does say no, he would never have to see her again, just like he said. I actually encouraged him to ask her out. Although she was both popular and pretty and would most certainly say no, I thought that his asking her would be a huge step for him. It would help him come out of his shell a bit, at least break the ice when it came to approaching girls in general. I told him that I would help him through it. I would help him get ready. At this point, we had been best friends for a decade, and I cared about him like a brother. Honestly, I was closer to him than I was with my own brother Rob, mostly because Rob was older than me, and he was actually pretty popular and typically busy with girls or work, so I wanted to help Ricky in any way I could. I decided that we would get him a haircut, and that since he and I were about the same size, he could also borrow some of my clothes. I wasn't walking around in super fancy clothes myself, but my clothes were at least modern and fit right. They didn't look like they came from a thrift store, and that was a big step up. He went over what he was going to say again and again. Eventually the day came. His hair was styled, he was dressed well, and he looked pretty decent overall. Still not a great looking guy, but it was a lot of progress. Throughout the day at school, he had several opportunities to approach her, but he continued to chicken out. Finally, he asked me if I would approach Emma with him. He said he would feel more confident if I were by his side. I told him that would be fine, and the next time we saw her, we were going up to her. My next class ended. I immediately went out to find Ricky. He was nervous and kept talking about backing out, but I made sure to encourage him. Suddenly, I spotted Emma. She was standing with a couple of her friends. We started walking over to her. Once we got close, Ricky said he didn't want to do it. He started to stop walking. I called, "Hey Emma," to get her attention. It was now or never. I began the conversation with her and eventually gave the cue to Ricky. Emma already looked confused as it was. Ricky, while looking down at the ground, said, I was wondering if you'd like to go out sometime." This definitely seemed to catch her off guard. She replied, well, I guess maybe. Can I think about it?" Ricky looked up in surprise. "Oh yeah, of course." Ricky had a lot more enthusiasm in his voice at this point. Before the silence got too awkward, I said, "Okay, well you girls have a good time," and Ricky and I walked off. He immediately started laughing. He was absolutely exhilarated at her reply. "I thought she was for sure going to say no," he exclaimed. He said even though there was still a good possibility she would end up saying no, that originally getting a maybe from her was better than nothing. Throughout the rest of the day, Emma was the only thing he would talk about. "I wonder when she's going to give me an answer. Her and John aren't actually dating, right? They just flirt a bit, but they aren't actually seeing each other, right?" It went on and on. The bell rang, indicating that the last period was over and school was done for the day. That was always such a great feeling. We didn't see Emma after school. We even casually waited around a bit before we walked to my car, but I guess we, or he, weren't lucky enough to run into her. "I'm sure you'll see her tomorrow," I said. "Yeah, probably, but the anticipation is killing me," he replied. Later that night, I was sitting at home. I had just finished my homework and was watching TV and playing around on my phone. A message popped up on my phone from Ricky. He said, "Dude, I'm freaking out right now." "Why's that?" I asked. After staring at Ricky as typing a message for a while, he replied, "I got a Facebook message from Emma. She asked for my phone number. I replied right away with it. I went to her profile so I could look at her pictures, but it's private. I sent her a friend request, but she hasn't accepted it yet. I feel like I'm getting mixed signals, lol. I didn't even know she had a Facebook. It looks like she used her first and middle name as her name, so I was never able to find her, lol." I messaged him back saying, "That's awesome, man. It's probably a good sign, or else she just would have messaged you saying no thanks. And she probably didn't get the friend request yet. Let me know when you hear from her next." We chatted back and forth a bit, until I told him I was going to sleep. The next morning, I sent a text to Ricky as I was leaving my house, letting him know that I was on my way. He texted back saying that he had something amazing to tell me. That made me happy. I got excited for him. He was waiting outside when I got to his house and started running up to my car before I even started to pull in his driveway. "You're not going to believe it, man. I woke up this morning and had text message from Emma. She ended up telling me that she'd be willing to go on a date with me. She said that the guys she's used to dating are always stuck up, and going on a date with me would be a nice change of pace." "Wow," I replied. "That's awesome, man. I'm super happy for you and proud of you. When are you guys going out, and what are you doing?" "Well, since it's Friday, we're going out tonight. We're going to meet up and play putt-putt, and then go get some food after." His happiness and excitement radiated through the car, and instantly improved my mood too. I expressed my excitement for him. I awkwardly asked him if he had enough money for everything. He assured me he still had a small amount of money set aside from shoveling snow earlier in the year. Emma is all we talked about until we got to school and had to go to our first classes. She's also basically all we talked about the rest of the day too. At one point, Ricky and I passed by her in the hallway. I looked over at him and saw him smiling at her, but she was too busy chatting with her friends and didn't even notice us walk by. "You should have said something to her," I told Ricky. "I almost did," he said. I choked though. We both laughed about it and agreed that he would have plenty of opportunities tonight to finally speak to her. At the end of the day, Ricky sent Emma a text just to confirm they were still on for their date. She replied back to him, telling him she would be there, and in the 10 years I've known Ricky, I've never seen him quite this excited. Ricky still had the outfit I let him borrow. I told him to make sure he washed the clothes and wore that outfit to the date, and also to do his hair the way I showed him. I dropped him off at his house, wished him luck, and told him to call me later to let me know how it went. I relaxed that evening and played some video games. At around 9 o'clock my phone rang. I expected it to be Ricky, but it was my buddy Jeff. "Hey, what's up, Jeff?" He quickly replied, almost cutting me off by asking me if I had talked to Ricky. I told him I haven't talked to him since I dropped him off at school. "Well, did you hear what happened to him?" he asked. "No, what do you mean?" I replied. He went on to tell me something that made me absolutely sick. A little before 7, when Ricky was supposed to meet up with Emma, he got a text from her. She told him she would meet him by the pavilion, which was right next to the little office at the putt-putt place. Apparently Ricky showed up, flowers in hand, and made his way over to the pavilion. He walked around a bit, looking for Emma. Finally, he decided to go sit in the pavilion and wait for her. As he was about to walk in, he was stopped dead in his tracks. Jeff told me that John and a couple of his friends were hiding on top of the pavilion. They had a bucket full of dog feces, urine, and a bunch of other nasty stuff, and dumped it all over Ricky. They then climbed down from the roof of the pavilion. They walked over to him, all hysterically laughing. Ricky was obviously upset and was trying to get everything off of him. Ricky's phone began to ring. Emma was calling him. Despite what just happened, he was so in love with her, he had to answer. He picked up. "Emma?" Just then, John walked over closer to him. Don't ever come near Emma again. She would never date your pathetic ass anyway, you idiot. Just then, Ricky noticed John's voice was coming both from in person and the phone. It was John texting him all along. It would also turn out that John made a fake Facebook profile too. Ricky had never talked to Emma since he asked her on the date. John threw the bucket at Ricky and he and his friends walked away. I was in shock. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I quickly got off the phone with Jeff and called Ricky. His phone went straight to voicemail. He probably didn't want to talk to anyone, which I understood. Still, I wasn't going to leave him alone. Right now he needed a friend, probably more so than he did 10 years ago when he was sitting in that bathroom stall crying. I immediately got my shoes on and raced out of the house. I drove over to Ricky's as fast as I could. I saw his parents' car wasn't there as I pulled in, so I didn't even bother knocking. I walked into Ricky's house, knowing I would probably find him sitting alone, crying, just like he was 8 years old all over again. I began to feel that rage enter back into my body. Man, I wish John was standing in front of me. I would love to finish what I started years ago. "Ricky!" I called out. I figured he was up in his room, so I didn't even bother looking around the downstairs. I made it up to his room, but he wasn't there. I checked the rest of the rooms upstairs and then looked around downstairs. I figured he might have still been walking home from the putt-putt place, although it wasn't far from his house. I decided I would drive there and try to find him on the way. I was about to walk out the door, and then I had a thought. He could have been in the basement washing my clothes that had been soiled. I didn't care about my clothes right now, and he didn't need to care about them either. I did see some light, albeit dim, coming from the basement as I began walking down the uneven, creaky wooden stairs. "Ricky!" I called out again. I made it down the stairs far enough to be able to see into the basement and nearly collapsed. Ricky's lifeless body hung in front of me, tied to a beam in the ceiling. No, Ricky!" I let out. I shuffled down the rest of the stairs and searched for a way to get him down. I tried lifting him to loosen the noose, but I wasn't able to. I frantically looked around and found a small handsaw. I sawed at the rope as hard as I could, and after several seconds, I managed to get through it. His body fell to the cold basement floor like someone dropped a marionette. I grabbed him and shook his body and screamed his name. But it was no use. He was as cold as the floor. His skin had a blue tint to it. I began crying hysterically and called for emergency services. I knew there was nothing they could do to help him, but I still figured it was the right thing to do. After calling, I broke down and sat on the floor, continuing to weep. And then suddenly, John's face popped in my mind. My hysteria instantly turned to rage. But unlike any type of rage I've ever previously experienced, I'm not certain there are words to describe what I began feeling. After the EMS arrived, and I answered all the police's questions, I got in my car. I didn't know exactly what I was planning on doing, but I had to find John. I had to let him know what he caused, what he did. He needed to be held accountable for this, because this was his fault. He killed Ricky. He killed my best friend. I drove to the putt-putt place, but as expected, he wasn't there. I decided I would try to find him at his house. I, like everyone else, knew where he lived. He always loved to brag about which house was his, like it was something he should be proud of, like it was like an accomplishment of his somehow. My rage continued to boil over. I couldn't think of anything else but John and Ricky's lifeless body. I got to John's house, but his douchey car wasn't there. He must have still been out with friends, partying and having a good time, while Ricky lay dead. I parked down the street and waited, and 2 hours later, he finally got home. It was around 1 a.m. by this point. My mom had been calling me, probably wondering where I was, but I was not answering the phone. Not now. I only had one thing in mind. I got out of my car and began quietly walking down the street. John stumbled out of his car. Not surprising, he was drinking and driving. He obviously doesn't value the lives of others. As I was feet away from him, I broke the silence. "What did you do?" He spun around and faced me, obviously startled. He looked at me. "What are you doing here, Mark?" "He's dead," I said. "He killed himself." "What are you talking about?" John asked. "Ricky, you asshole! After your little stunt, he killed himself. You caused this. You did this." "Me?" he replied. "Listen, that guy was a freak long before—" That's the last thing I heard John say. I wasn't letting him insult Ricky, not one more single time. Once again, I found myself launching into John with more vicious intent and power than ever before. I felt the rage and adrenaline flow through my body, and I loved it. I got John to the ground. He fell into his car and was partially sitting up with his back against the rear bumper. I began striking him with everything I had in me. Things were a little different than when we fought as kids. For one, I was more enraged now than ever. But also, John was the star quarterback of the high school's football team. He was big and he was strong. And I mean strong. On any average day, any random person would think I was insane for trying to start a fight with a guy that looked like John. But I snapped. I didn't care if I got hurt. I just wanted John to suffer. With him drunk and adrenaline flowing through my veins, we ended up becoming pretty evenly matched, despite me being smaller and weaker. I did my best to strike John, and he did his best to block my shots and get off the ground. John should have been winning this exchange, but I wouldn't allow it. I postured up and grabbed John by the throat and began to choke him as hard as I could. I wrapped my fingers around his neck and dug my thumbs deep into his voice box. He began to show signs of panic, and I continued pressing down, and everything else happened in what seemed like a blink of an eye. I remember John grabbing my arms, trying to loosen my grip. Eventually one of his hands let go. When it reappeared, it had a pocket knife in it. The knife came swinging at my face, but I dodged it just in time. While keeping one hand on his throat, I grabbed for the knife with my other hand. I desperately struggled to get the knife from him. I started smashing his hand against the other car, over and over and over again. Eventually, it fell from his likely broken hand. I reached for it, and when I did, John was able to roll me over and get into a more dominant position over me. He was incredibly strong. He got me on my side and was pushing down on my face with his hand. I started losing. I panicked and decided I would swing the knife at him as hard as I could, and hopefully I got lucky. I gripped it tight, and as I twisted my body around as hard as I could, the knife hit its mark. His grip loosened, and I struggled away from him. I got to my feet and turned around to face him. It was time to finish this. But it was already done. John laid there, next to his car. The pocket knife was dug deep into the side of his neck. He weakly tried pulling it out, but he was losing consciousness fast. He was dying, and it was clear. I felt the most calm and peaceful I've ever felt in my entire life. Like, I restored balance to a universe which had been misaligned my entire life. I knelt down next to him. He looked up at me, reaching towards me for help, but I just stared at him smiling until he took his last breath. I pulled the pocket knife out of his neck and put it in my pocket. I knew it had my prints all over it. I wasn't dumb enough to leave it behind. I raced home from there. When I got home, it appeared everyone had gone to bed. I got myself cleaned up, laid in bed, and the peace continued as I drifted off to sleep. That peace ended when I woke up the next morning. The grief from losing Ricky and the fear I felt because of what happened with John came racing in my mind. I slowly made my way downstairs, where I found my mom sitting at the table in the kitchen. "Good morning, honey," she said with a smile. "Oh man, I guess she didn't hear about Ricky yet. Mom, I have something to tell you." I began to tell her about the incident with Ricky, about the horrible tragedy that could have been avoided. I did my best to hold back the tears, and then I was interrupted. Sweetie, we've been over this so many times." I looked at her with confusion. "It's okay, hon. I know it's confusing when you get like this. Ricky doesn't actually exist, Mark." What in the hell was she talking about? I began to interject, but she stopped me. "I'll give you the same explanation I always do, hon. When you were 8 years old, you began to get bullied a lot. You really didn't have any friends. So I got excited when you started talking about Ricky. Soon, I found out he was just an imaginary friend. I thought you were a bit old for imaginary friends, but you seemed happy. Even though I started getting phone calls from your principal, he would tell me that you were complaining to him and talking to him about a student that didn't go there, someone named Ricky. I slowly began to realize that Ricky was more than just an imaginary friend. Eventually it got so bad I had to bring you to a doctor. He determined that you had schizophrenia and that you had intense delusions, often to cope with painful situations in your life. When something bad happened to you, in your head it was happening to Ricky. Instead of being the target, you became a bystander. You often would tell me stories that you or Ricky did, but they weren't true. You told me about a fight that happened at school on a day where you didn't even have school. The delusions were powerful and intricate. Eventually, your illness began to progress with age. As much as I hated the idea of putting you on medication, I felt like I was left with no choice. Sometimes you would be mentally present, and other times you were totally in your own little world. But the medication helped. It stopped the delusions from happening. You've been doing so well lately, but when you stop taking your medication, you become a different person. You have these weird, false memories of what your life has been like this far. Some of the events you mentioned were true, while others I know were manufactured in your own mind. This happens every time you stop taking your meds. I should have watched over you closer, but you were doing so well. Oh, I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I know it hurts you every time I have to explain this to you, but you will feel much better once you're back on your medication. I'll get it for you now. You can only begin to imagine the shock I felt. Once I was able to get my thoughts together, I asked, "So when I look back on my life, none of it happened?" "A lot of it happened," she replied, "but a lot of it was also made up in your mind while you weren't taking the medication you needed. Here, go ahead and take this, honey. You will feel better soon." I took the pill from her hand and placed it in my mouth. Still in absolute disbelief, I washed it down with a sip of water. I began slowly walking up towards the stairs so I could go to my room. I'm just gonna go upstairs for a bit." "I know, hon," she replied. "I'm familiar with the routine." I felt horrible. I felt like my life was a lie. How did I let this happen? How did I lose control over myself? It just wasn't fair. Ricky and I had such fond memories for so many years. How did he not exist? Was she making all this up so I wouldn't get depressed over Ricky killing himself and kill myself too? Thoughts continued to race, but the pill I took made me drowsy fast. The last thing I remember was laying in my bed. I woke up again that evening. I felt good. Although foggy from the medication and just waking up, I also felt this sense of clearness. I went and talked to my mom. She confirmed that our conversation earlier in the day actually happened. I began to put things together. My thoughts actually felt rational again, even though I didn't know they weren't at one point. I really did feel better, just like my mom said I would. I was just relieved. I felt relieved that my friend didn't kill himself, even though that meant I didn't have that special person in my life to begin with. More than anything, I was relieved I wasn't a damn murderer. I felt like I could accept how messed up I was, and that my life was going to be good from here on. My mom and I finished talking. I gave her a hug and told her I was going upstairs to play video games. "Okay, honey, I'll be up in a bit gathering clothes so I can finish the laundry." "Sounds good, Mom," I replied. I jogged up the steps and headed into my room. I started up my PS4 and began to gather up my dirty clothes for my mom so I could throw them in the basket. I took my belt out of my jeans, removed my wallet, and checked my pockets. I felt something weird in my jeans. I fished it out of my pocket. I stood alone, in my room, while the universe began to swallow me, as I looked down at John's bloody pocket knife, resting in my hand. Mark. Mark. Hey, Mark, wake up. Come on, it's almost 7:30. Ugh, I always hated being woken up before I was really ready to get out of bed. It makes no sense. Even though I'm woken up every morning long before I'm ready, I still have so much trouble falling asleep at night. I finally opened my eyes and looked over at Eddie. He was standing in the doorway of my room, with way too much excitement on his face for this early in the morning. "I'll meet you down there, give me 5 minutes," I said. This was basically our one way to find some excitement in this place. I think the biggest part of the excitement was the rush we got from sneaking around, trying not to get caught. I got out of bed and quickly got dressed, grabbing the playing card before I walked out of the room. I snuck down the hall and quickly opened up the side door, making sure I kept the handle turned as I shut it after slipping through. I tiptoed down the stairs and walked through the other door as quickly as the first. At the end of the hall, I saw Eddie waiting for me. He noticed me and started waving at me to hurry up, with a huge smile on his face like always. Eddie was obviously a very friendly guy. He was always in such a great mood. Well, except for when he wasn't. But when he went into his depressions, he wouldn't get out of bed anyway. So since I would never see him while he was in that kind of condition, it was easy to forget he would get like that at all. Eddie and I walked outside. As I shut the door, I put the playing card over the strike plate so it wouldn't latch. We snuck around to the side of the building so we'd be out of view and lit up our cigarettes. I never even smoked cigarettes until I met Eddie, but it helped pass the time and I eventually started enjoying it. Not enough to continue doing it once I left this place, if that even ever happens. It feels like I've already been here for a lifetime. Let me explain. I used to have some problems with my mental health. Basically, seemingly at random, and without warning, I would begin having these delusions. Sometimes I would remember an event correctly. Sometimes I would only remember bits and pieces of it correctly. And other times, I would fabricate certain things completely. My doctor says that I experienced so much pain as a child that I would make more and more things up in my head to cope with them. My dad died when I was just a baby, so I'm sure that didn't help either. Also, I was bullied a lot. I see all of this clearly now, but at other times, I didn't. My mom eventually caught on that there was something going on more aside from me having an active imagination, and I was put on medication when I was still just a child. When I actually took the medication, it made me practically normal, which is really all I've ever wanted. It's still all I want. To live a nice, boring, normal life. A regular job that I don't like, a small home, a girlfriend or wife, a dog, maybe some kids. But there were times that I stopped taking my medication. My doctor says it's common for people like me. We take our medication for a period of time, and we begin getting used to feeling normal. So used to it, in fact, that we either tell ourselves we no longer need it, or forget about it altogether. So throughout my life, I would have slips, and then someone, usually my mom, would notice, and I would go back on my meds. But one of those slips went unnoticed until it was too late. Until I killed someone. There was this kid I went to school with named John. He tortured me my entire life, and eventually, it led me to killing him. I never intended on killing him, I really didn't. But one night, my anger boiled over and we fought. He pulled a knife on me during the struggle, and it ended up in his neck. Now the problem was that I came to his house, and I attacked him. So I was still considered to be at fault for this whole altercation. My only saving grace was that the murder weapon was indeed determined to have belonged to John. Well, that and the fact that I was determined to not be mentally competent to stand trial. My charges went from second-degree murder to manslaughter, based on the fact that I didn't actually show up at John's with a weapon. But since it was eventually determined that I wasn't able to stand trial, I was sent to the state psychiatric hospital, and then eventually here. This place is actually great, at least compared to the others. I started off in jail for months while waiting for the court proceedings to be over. Jail wasn't as bad as I would have guessed, although I was placed in the mental health pod, so maybe it wasn't as bad in there as it is in other places. The state psychiatric hospital was more comparable to what I would have guessed prison to be like, rather than a hospital. It was dark, dirty, and flat out scary. I actually feared for my life in there at times. It was a dark part of my life that I do my best to forget about, but it still haunts me at times. Luckily, I was only there for about 6 months. It didn't take the doctors long to determine that I wasn't much of a threat as long as I took my medication, and as long as I was institutionalized, there was no worry that I would stop taking it. Then I was transferred here, the Elmhurst Mental Health Rehabilitation Center, more commonly just referred to as Elmhurst. This place is more like an actual hospital, a nice, safe, clean environment. The biggest thing to fear at this place is dying of boredom. I, of course, lived on the long-term treatment floor. There are other floors and sections to this place, such as the clinic, which is where patients might stay a night or two if they develop a physical illness or injury. There's the crisis intervention ward, which is mostly for people who are depressed or suicidal and need to be observed for a few days until they are in good enough shape to be on their own. There's also an entire floor that is a 30-day drug and alcohol rehabilitation center. And then there's our floor, the ward for those who will be here indefinitely. Those who need to be separated from the good people of the general public. Although, if you ended up in this particular center, you were deemed to be stable enough. I've spent almost 3.5 years at this particular facility, therefore it's been almost 4 years since my conviction. I was sentenced here for an indefinite amount of time. Technically speaking, those sent here will be here until the doctors say they can leave at their discretion, so some can be here for anywhere between 1 day and the rest of their lives. Typically speaking, from what I've heard, if you were sent here for killing someone, they were keeping you institutionalized for at least 5 years before actually considering to use their discretion as to whether or not you needed to be here. Eddie's about 20 years older than me or so. I don't know his exact age, so this is just kind of a guess. He and I were both sent to this particular facility right around the same time. When you first get here, you start off in a double room with another patient, and Eddie happened to be my roommate. We spent about 3 months together in that same room. We relied on each other a lot during those first 3 months, and still do to this day. So despite being a bit apart in age, we became rather close friends. I don't know Eddie's exact story, but apparently he has been bounced around from institution to institution for what he says to be all of his adult life. At times, I've asked him how he is able to stay so positive. He claims that a lot of medical breakthroughs have happened over the last several years, and that the doctors have finally been able to get him on the right balance of medications. He feels that he has a very good chance of getting out of this place soon. In fact, for months now, he's been talking about getting into a halfway house, and what he will do when he's there. He talks about it a lot, actually. I think it helps to keep him hopeful. Apparently Eddie wouldn't last long at the other facilities he's been to. He would do well for a period of time, maybe 3 months, maybe 6, and then have some sort of physical outburst towards a doctor or another staff member and be shipped out to the next facility. But like myself, he's been here at Elmhurst for 3.5 years, so I think the doctors really have begun to figure him out, although I'd like to take some of the credit myself for keeping him sane. Eddie and I quickly finished our cigarettes and snuck back up to our floor. We had 2 opportunities per day to sneak out for a quick smoke, at both 7:30 a.m. and p.m. Those were the 2 shift change times, when basically all of the staff leaving would have a quick meeting with the staff arriving, updating them on how things have been going with the patients during the last shift. The day-to-day life here was pretty boring. Aside from getting our quick fix outside twice a day, we would often get a little excitement when a new patient was brought onto our floor. This was few and far between on this floor, unfortunately. Most people, like Eddie or I, were stuck here for a long time. Our days consisted of group counseling, individual counseling, art hour, board game hour, TV time, meals, etc. We were allowed to have visitors on either Saturday or Sunday. They had to be scheduled visits that took place in private rooms for the sake of the other patient's privacy. My mother would visit me almost every Sunday. My brother Rob had graduated from college shortly after I was sent to the state mental hospital. He accepted a job halfway across the country. He's since gotten married and has put down roots there. Every so often I speak to him on the phone, but we've lost touch a bit, I'll admit that. My mother, though, she is everything to me. She has stood by my side in every possible way, not only through this entire mess, but my entire life. She is the most amazing, loving woman in the world. It breaks my heart that she is all alone. Her husband died shortly after giving birth to their second child. Her first son moved away, and her second son has been institutionalized for nearly 4 years. I try not to think about all of this, though, as it is the one thing that puts me in a state of desperation to leave here. But as long as I keep out of all that in my mind, I'm quite comfortable and okay here. A routine is what keeps me sane. I keep myself busy, and in addition to the daily activities the staff has scheduled for us each day, I have my own things written into the schedule as well. This keeps my idle time limited. If I'm not in a class or counseling session, I'm either exercising, writing, talking to Eddie, or sneaking out for a smoke. I still have no clue how most of these people can just sit around watching TV in the evening without a care in the world. That's not enough to occupy my attention. Regardless of what's on TV, I always find myself getting lost in my own thoughts. And before I know it, I've spent a half hour torturing myself about thinking about my mom, or all the time I've wasted. I don't spend that much time thinking about John. I don't know why, but I don't. For some reason, I still resent him. He's dead, but I still resent him. I do feel bad for John's parents, but I think my resentment for John keeps most of the guilt suppressed. It's amazing how much impact one person can have on your life. I blame him for driving me further into my insanity. I blame him for making me do what I did, and for putting me in this place. I feel like, as long as I'm here, he still has control over me, and that makes me angry. I know I'm not going to be here forever, so I do my best to stay hopeful. I stay busy, and anytime I find myself with nothing to do, I know I can go talk to Eddie. He's my best friend. We've made a pact. Whichever one of us gets out of here first will come and visit the other. Plus, at this point, I probably owe him around $1 million for all the cigarettes he bums me that his mom sneaks in for him during visits. As days passed, we continued up our normal routine. Things were good, and Eddie was as cheerful as ever. Well, that was until we were in the middle of our board game one night. Eddie and I were partners, just like usual. We were playing Scrabble together, having fun and joking around with each other like normal. Suddenly, Eddie became quiet. His entire demeanor just changed out of nowhere. I asked him, "Eddie, are you okay?" He lowered his head into his hands and started crying. I'd never seen him like this, and it kind of scared me. I stood up and walked around the table. I knelt down and put my arm around him. "What's wrong, man? Was it something I said?" He took a couple breaths and calmed down and said, They changed my status to level 1. They're going to start making arrangements for my discharge." "Eddie, that's great. That's what you wanted," I replied. He looked up at me and said, I'm scared. I've been in a facility my entire life, it seems. I wouldn't even know what to do once I got out. I mean, yeah, I've always wanted to get out of here, but I'm scared. I feel safe here." "Eddie," I said, "they're not just going to kick you out the front door. Like you've been saying, they're going to put you in a halfway house. They make sure that people like us have a steady, smooth transition. This is great news, man. I understand that you're scared, but you're going to have plenty of time to get out there and make a life for yourself." "I know, Mark. I know I have time. But the world has just changed so much since I've been in here. I don't know how anything works. Cell phones, computers, the internet? I don't know anything about that stuff," he said. I went on to assure him that it wasn't all that difficult, and that he was a smart guy. And he really was. A lack of intelligence was never Eddie's problem, but I understood his fear. I'd been institutionalized for not even quite 4 years, but even I felt as if life was passing me by. 4 years, and what had I gained while here? Even all the way back to when I was being held in the county jail, they put me back on my proper meds. The problem with me was solved right then and there. I've spent the next 4 years talking to counselors and psychiatrists, telling them everything they want to hear. But there's just nothing to gain here. There's no mystery that needs solved. I have a condition. It's irreversible and there's no cure for it, but it is treatable. All I need to do is take my meds and then I'm fine. That was figured out 4 years ago, and since then, nothing else has been accomplished. I've merely been watching life pass me by. By now, I could be graduating college. Instead, I don't even have a high school diploma. Remember when I talked about getting trapped in my own thoughts if I didn't keep myself occupied? Well, there's another example. I have the ability to imprison myself in my own mind, hold myself captive and torture myself. There have been times in the past where Eddie and I have even talked about escaping this place. We've stood outside smoking cigarettes and asked one another, why don't we just take off together? We could each come up with a new alias and just run off. We would always discuss this in a joking manner, but I knew each of us had the actual fantasy of really doing it. But we both knew we'd be caught, probably sooner rather than later. And when caught, we would be sent back to the state psychiatric hospital, aka prison, where we would more than likely be left to die. But it was fun to talk about. It was just another element of excitement we could deposit into our lives. The next morning, Eddie and I snuck out for a smoke like usual. He was in a much better mood than he was the night before. He explained to me that it could be weeks or even longer before he was moved into the transitional housing. He had been in a bit of a panic the night before, thinking he was going to be moved into a strange house the very next day or something. In art class that day, we were supposed to draw out what our lives were going to look like 5 years from now. I had no idea what to draw. It's not that I didn't want to participate, well, I kind of didn't, but it was mostly that I just had no idea what to draw. I try not to think about the future or the past. I try to stay in the present, or else I'll begin torturing myself again. I try to do the same thing when reading books, but the next thing I know, several pages have gone by, and I haven't actually interpreted a single word. Art isn't much better when it comes to helping either. I decided to give up on the project. It was useless. As I was sitting around waiting for class to be over, my counselor Randy came in, asking me to come talk with him. This wasn't totally unusual. Sometimes the counselors had some questions they needed answered in order to finish their charting. I followed Randy down the hall into his office, and to my surprise, my mom was there waiting for us. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I said. She stood up and gave me a long hug. "Please have a seat, Mark," said Randy. We all sat down. "Mark, your mom is here because she has something she needs to tell you, and she wanted to talk to you in person and be the one who tells you," he said. "Tell me what? What happened? Is Rob okay?" My mind began to race, and I felt myself inching closer and closer to a panic attack. "No, Mark, it's nothing like that," my mom said. "Mark, I'm here because I need to tell you, I need to tell you that I'm sick." "Sick how? What do you mean?" I replied. She continued, "Mark, a few months ago I began feeling ill. I was tired all the time, I could hardly eat, and I had an awful pain near my stomach. Eventually it got so bad that I went to go get checked out. Long story short, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer." Well, what does that mean? How did they fix it?" "Sweetie, the oncologist and radiologist said I could go through with chemotherapy and radiation, but they were doubtful it would do much good and would probably only make me awfully sick. We just caught this a bit late. It's an aggressive cancer and has already metastasized, which means it's spreading." "Well, what does it mean? What are you saying?" "For now, all they can do is try to keep me comfortable. The doctor said I have about 6 weeks left, give or take." 6 weeks? No! Mom, you can't go yet. You can't leave me. I need you. I need you. Honey, you've come such a long way. I'm so proud of you. You've grown into a man, and you're a wonderful person. You've gotten the help you need. I promise you, we will get through this." Just then, Randy began to speak. "Mark, your mom called yesterday after her appointment to let us know what she found out about her condition. You've done very well here, and haven't had any issues since you've been taking your medication. I've talked with your doctors here, and we came to an agreement. I moved you down to level 1. In light of what's going on, we are discharging you to go home with your mom and spend time with her. We all agreed it would be worse for your mental health if we kept you here and restricted your contact with her during her last days. But there are conditions to this release, as you will be put on probation. First and foremost, we need you to agree to a new type of medication delivery system. Once a month, you will come to the clinic to get an injection. This injection will be the same exact medication you're already taking. The only difference is that you only need to take it once a month. The shot is designed to slowly release the medication over a 30-day period. This will ensure that you won't stop taking your meds, whether intentionally or by accident. You will receive the injection before you're discharged here, and we will set you up with an appointment. You must not miss an appointment here. You will also have to continue going to your counseling appointments. Also, I think this goes without saying, you cannot engage in any type of criminal behavior. Do you understand? At this point, the different waves of emotions were crashing through me. I could feel the despair, the anguish, and the desperation physically throw through my body as it competed with the excitement and relief that came with knowing I was getting out of here. I began feeling guilty that I was even able to feel any level of excitement after receiving the news about my mom's condition. She and I embraced, and we both began crying. I was told that my out date would be the following day. I had to go to the clinic at 8 a.m. to receive my first shot of medication. After that, I was free to go home. Free. After my mom left, I went to my room and just laid in bed, which is where I remained for the rest of the night. I just couldn't believe any of this was happening. My mom was way too young for this to be happening to her. She of all people didn't deserve this. I'm going to get out of this place. My mom is going to leave me, and I'm going to be on my own. I just couldn't imagine being able to get by on my own. I haven't even spent a single day of my adult life outside of some type of facility. But then, I thought even more about my mom, and a sense of peace came over me when I realized that she would probably already have a plan set up for me. She'll let me know exactly what to do. She's going to be dead in 6 weeks, but I would bet everything I have that she is more concerned about making sure I'll be okay than she is about her own death. She's just that kind of person. I knew that she and I would stay glued together these last 6 weeks. I'll take care of her, and she'll take care of me. With peaceful thoughts flowing through my mind, I finally drifted off to sleep. "Mark, come on, man, we have to hurry." I was woken up by my normal alarm clock. Eddie telling me to get out of bed so we could go sneak in a quick smoke. Once I came to, I was flooded with emotion all over again. Despair, due to the situation with my mom, excitement because I was finally going home, and nervousness because I was going to have to tell Eddie I was leaving today. He and I relied on each other for everything, and I knew he was going to be devastated. I told him I would meet him down there. Once I went through all the proper motions, we lit up our cigarettes and began talking. "Eddie," I said, "I've got something to tell you, man. My mom is sick. She's really sick. I've been switched down to level 1. They're letting me go home. I just found this out yesterday. You're the first person I've told." Eddie looked like he wasn't sure what to say to all of this, but he spoke anyway. "I'm really sorry to hear this. What's wrong with your mom? And when is your out date scheduled for?" "Eddie, I'm leaving today. My mom has cancer. It's bad. It's really bad. The doctors say she maybe has 6 weeks left. So Randy told me they decided it would be best for me to let me spend the rest of her time by her side." I started to tear up once I finished talking. Eddie replied with, "You're gonna come visit me, right?" He also began to tear up, and I told him that of course I would come visit. He gave me a strong bear-like hug, and we realized we had to hurry back inside before shift change ended. We got back upstairs and ate breakfast together, and he asked for some more details about my mom. I said my goodbyes to Eddie and the rest of the people on my unit and headed down to the clinic. The injection they gave me was rather uncomfortable, but tolerable. It was a good thing though, a really good thing actually. I hate even admitting this, but sometimes, under Eddie's strict observation, I would go visit my friend, Ricky. I did this by cheeking my medication, which meant that I would only pretend to swallow it and then set it aside. After a few days of not taking it, Ricky, my best friend, would come back. Once the medication was out of my system, Eddie would make sure I stayed in my room so none of the staff would notice my unusual behavior. Ricky was someone I created in my head when I was just a little boy, and ever since, as long as I was off my meds, I would see him. He would suddenly be back and would seem as real as you or me. Once Eddie thought I'd spent enough time with him, he would make me take my meds, and then I would come back to reality. I know now the game we played was very reckless. I'm lucky I never got caught. And anyway, sometimes when I went back and saw my friend, it wasn't a pleasant reunion. There were times when he would suddenly show up, and he would be in my room, hanging from the ceiling. The memory from what I conjured up in my mind would flash back violently. Ricky, hanging lifelessly with a rope around his neck, would suddenly wake up. He would lift his head and look at me, with his arms outstretched, reaching for me to help him. I would race towards him and try to free him from the noose. I would grab at the rope, clawing at it to pull it away from his neck. But despite my efforts, I would only manage to rip his flesh from his body. Other times he would show up and be walking in like normal, but his body would be decomposing and falling apart. It was awful. It was few and far between when something like this would happen, and when it did, Eddie was quick to give me my meds. Looking back, it was just me chasing a ghost, wanting to see my friend, just looking for a false sense of happiness. It was just an overall bad idea, and this injection wouldn't allow me to try it anymore. After I left the clinic, I headed back upstairs to grab my bags. It had only taken me about 5 minutes to pack since we weren't allowed to have a lot of stuff here. Randy walked me outside and wished me luck. I gave him a hug and thanked him again. As soon as I saw my mom, waiting for me with a big smile on her face, all of the negative feelings I was carrying around immediately disappeared. It felt so good being out of that place, finally free to do anything I want. I could actually start my life now. We got in the car and began driving home. Luckily, Elmhurst was only a 35-minute drive from where we lived. It was surreal driving back into my hometown. So many things looked exactly as I remembered, and so many other things were so different. We finally got home. My mom had left my room exactly as it was when I got arrested. I laid down in my bed. Oh God, how I miss this bed. My mom and I spent the first night just enjoying each other's company. We ordered pizza and spent most of the night just talking. I decided that I would begin to look around for work. I wanted to wait until after my mom passed away so I could spend as much time with her as possible. But it just felt weird. I didn't want to just wait for her to die, regardless of the circumstances. She gave me some ideas on where to apply. We talked about my brother Rob. He has a great job, but he just lives so far away. My mother told me that he was trying to set up some time off from work so he could come stay with us during my mom's last days and be present for the funeral. It was so weird talking to my mom about her funeral. She was sitting in front of me, still looking just like herself. She was looking completely normal, and to know that within 6 weeks she was going to deteriorate and die, was as weird to me as it was devastating. Over the next few days, my mom and I spent almost all of our waking hours together. She treated me so incredibly well. We did a lot of shopping. She tried extremely hard to get me back on my feet. We got some new clothes, a cell phone, and all the odds and ends a person needs from day to day. I managed to get my driver's license back and finally got to drive a car again. From that point on, I began doing most of the driving, as my mom was tired a lot and was slowly getting worse. I couldn't believe how well I was adapting. I'd gone to visit Eddie once so far, but not every Sunday like I first planned on. It was a lot of work getting approved to visit someone there, and I stayed pretty busy helping out my mom. So I didn't end up visiting him as often as planned, but I'm sure he understood. Things were going well. I was at the grocery store getting the list of items my mother had written down, and that's when I ran into him, John's father, who also happened to be named John. My mom had told me about him since I've been home. Apparently, after his son's death, things just got worse and worse for him. He basically had his own form of a mental breakdown. He and his wife ended up getting divorced. John Sr. had a very large, lucrative business. Between the divorce and his lack of attention, he had all but completely lost his own business. He had nothing left. I went to turn down an aisle, and that's when I first saw him, standing at the end of the aisle. I quickly went to turn around so he didn't see me. I didn't want to deal with how awkward that would be, or especially with the anger he had toward me. But I wasn't quick enough, and he spotted me. I quickly walked through the store, but every time I passed an aisle, I saw him looking down towards me, as he kept walking in the same direction as me. I turned around and started walking in the other direction. It appeared that I had lost him, but then suddenly, he popped out the end of the aisle and was standing directly in front of me. I froze. I had no idea what to do or say. He stepped very close to me and quietly said, "I don't know how you skipped through the system so fast. You might have fooled everyone else, but you haven't fooled me. Be rest assured, your punishment for what you did to my son hasn't even begun." He stared at me for a few uncomfortable seconds and then walked away. This definitely had me a little shaken up, to say the least, but I had other things to worry about for now. It had been 4 weeks since I've gotten out of Elmhurst. Within this period of time, my mom deteriorated quickly. She was now basically bound to her bed, aside from getting up to use the restroom. She was still capable of at least that much. Days passed, and my brother Rob finally was able to make it. Things with him were weird. He stayed in a hotel, even though we had plenty of space in the house. He treated me like I was almost a stranger. I think he judged me a lot for what happened, and I guess I really can't blame him. Eventually, nurses started staying in the house more and more often, and then, in just what seemed like a blink of an eye, she was gone. It felt like she had just picked me up from Elmhurst, full of life and shopping with me. I thought of her smile that day, and now she was gone. Yes, I was heartbroken, but I forced myself to think of the good times and not dwell on the sadness of her being gone. My mom had everything set up ahead of time for her services. A lot of people showed up, and then it was over. The very next day, my brother had to fly back home for work. We were told that an attorney was going to be receiving a copy of my mom's will, and that Rob and I would find out all the details within a couple weeks. She had already told me she was leaving me the house, since I needed it, and Rob had no interest in it anyway. The house felt so empty after she was gone. The loneliness got to me quick. I promised my mom before she died that I would make sure I found some friends and wouldn't spend all my time alone. I started doing things to fill my time. I started applying to places to find a job, but I wasn't in a huge hurry. Outside of the will, my mom left me a good amount of money to live off of for quite a while. I also began going to the gym a few times a week, and also to the library so I wouldn't spend so much time at home by myself. And that's where I met her, Haley. It started by chance, so randomly, just because of a book. I was sitting down with a book, and she noticed what I was reading. She made a joke about the book, and we started talking. I made a habit out of driving to the next town over for everything I did. Everyone in my hometown gave me weird looks. I was the psycho murderer that killed the innocent boy with a promising future, and I especially didn't want to run into John Sr. But Haley didn't look at me like that. She had no clue who I was. We began talking, and I told her a bit about myself. I told her about my mom and my brother. She told me a bit about herself as well, and before I knew it, we had been talking for 45 minutes.
The conversation ended when she had to leave, but she gave me her phone number before saying goodbye. In my entire life, I've never really had anyone I could call a girlfriend. If I knew this girl was interested in me like that during our conversation, I probably would have blown it. She was a pretty girl. Really pretty, actually. I was definitely caught off guard when she gave me her phone number, but I was excited. I waited a couple days, and then I sent her a text. From that point on, we began talking on a regular basis. Feelings for one another developed quickly. In a matter of days, we went on what you could consider a first date. I didn't formally ask her out on a date, but we went to dinner and went on a walk through the park. We spent hours talking that night. I really felt like we got to know one another. Haley was a year younger than me. She had medium brown hair, green eyes, a nice smile, and was really short, which I liked. She was a very down-to-earth person, and we got along great. I eventually felt comfortable enough with her to tell her about my past, and she didn't run away. Instead, she felt sympathy for me. I couldn't tell you what it was about this girl, but we just connected somehow. A couple weeks went by, and I finally grew the courage to ask her to be my girlfriend. She gladly said yes. We ended up making plans for this coming Friday to go to the movies. What was significant about these plans was that Haley agreed to come spend the night with me after the date. I spent the next couple days cleaning up the house, which had become messy over the weeks. I picked Haley up Friday evening. She looked beautiful as always, but seemed kind of upset. It just looked like she might have been crying earlier. I obviously asked her what was wrong, but she promised it was nothing. She said she was just feeling hormonal or something. I accepted the response, and we headed to the cinema. From that point on, she seemed to be in a much better mood. We held hands while we watched a pretty awful movie. We spent more time making fun of it than we actually did watching it, but it made the overall experience more enjoyable. As we were leaving the movie theater, I asked her if she wanted to go get food before we went to my house. She agreed, and we headed to my car. We finally decided on a place and began heading there. We decided to take the scenic route on our way across town to the restaurant. There was a very nice stretch of scenic road that linked one busier part of town to the other. I turned onto the road, and Haley reached her hand over to hold mine. We were taking turns quoting some of the more awful lines of the movie and laughing when I noticed a set of headlights coming up behind me. The only reason this caught my attention was because of how quickly the person was gaining on me. I was driving right around the speed limit, so this person was obviously speeding. I was initially worried that it was the police, but once they got closer, they didn't appear to have lights on top of their car. It looked like the car was going to pass me for a moment, but as soon as they were next to me, they slowed down again and got behind me. Haley and I talked about how weird they were being, but then brushed it off as nothing. A few minutes passed by, and the car started to pass me again, but then slowed down a bit, and did what I can only describe as an attempt at the pit maneuver. The front corner of their car lightly bumped into the back corner of mine. Instinctually, I began to slow down to pull over, as that's what you'd normally do after getting into an accident. But before I even had the chance to do it, they bumped into me again in just the same way. It was obvious at this point that they were trying to ram me off the road. I decided stopping was a bad idea and that I needed to speed up to get away from whoever this was. I was about to tell Haley my idea, but she beat me to it and told me we needed to lose these people and to gun it. I pressed down on the accelerator and went as fast as I could without feeling too unsafe. Luckily for me, the person behind me had probably only seen the pit maneuver on TV and didn't have any actual training to pull it off. I guess it was one of those things, it wasn't as easy as it looked. The car did its best to stay caught up with me at first, but at the pace we were going, we quickly got to the next busy part of town, at which point the car went its own way. I tried getting a look at the car, but they had let up before turning onto the main road, so it was difficult. At that point, I cared more about getting away from them than anything. Once we felt safe, we pulled over and I checked out my car. There were some scratches on it, but the damage wasn't too bad. I told Haley that tomorrow I would file a police report so that I would have what happened on record. We were both pretty shaken up, but I didn't want to show my fear to Haley. I certainly would have been panicking much more if I had been by myself when it happened. We ate together at the restaurant and talked about what happened. After a while, we managed to change the subject. Before long, we headed back to my place for our first sleepover. The drive was nice and uneventful. But when we got to my house, it was a different story. We walked up to my door, and that's when we saw it. It was John's class photo, pinned up to my door by a knife. I began to look around, half worried about my safety and half worried that Haley was going to want to go home. To my surprise, she nonchalantly walked up to the door, pulled the knife out of it, and threw it and the picture on the ground. All she said was, "Don't let him get to you." I was even happier now at this point that I had decided to tell Haley everything about me. Haley and I had a really good time together that night. I'm not one to kiss and tell, not that I'd ever had the chance before now, but let's just say I experienced a few firsts that night. Over the next few days, we spent all of our free time with one another. I knew it was early on, but I fell for Haley. I didn't want to say anything that would freak her out, but one night, it just slipped out, and I told her. As soon as I said it, I regretted it because I didn't want to mess things up with her. But to my surprise, she said it back. We had only been together for a few weeks, but I knew she was the one. We started talking about building a life together in the future. She was currently living with her parents, and her dad could be verbally abusive towards her when he drank, which happened way too often. She was confiding in me after another one of his benders, when I jokingly told her that she should just move in with me. Secretly, I really wanted her to. And then she told me she actually didn't think it was such a bad idea. About 30 seconds worth of talking later, and we made it an official plan. Her parents weren't exactly thrilled with the idea. They told her that it was too soon and tried to convince her to continue living with them, but we were adults and there was nothing they can do. Despite the rather cold way they treated me, I remained as pleasant as possible towards them as Haley and I moved out her belongings. We spent an entire day moving all of her stuff into my house, and we were exhausted by the time we were done. I still had a decent amount of money left over from what my mom left for me, but I knew it would be a good idea to find a job for myself soon. Haley and I talked about it. She told me that she would be happy to get a job too, but she was already in school and I didn't want her to have to drop out or start taking fewer classes. Plus, the house was already paid for, and so was my car, so our expenses were minimal. We'd be better off in the long run anyway if she stayed in school full time. The next morning, I was woken up by my phone ringing. It was my mom's attorney. He informed me that the will had been reviewed and was wondering when Rob and I could meet with him. I explained the situation with Rob to him and told him that I would have to give him a call back after seeing when and if Rob could come for the meeting. I went back to sleep and made a mental note to call Rob later in the day. A couple days went by and I finally remembered to call Rob. He said he would find out when he could get a couple days off from work and would let me know. I started putting job applications in all over the place, hoping something would turn up. I didn't really have any work experience, so I knew finding something might be difficult. When I got a phone call from an unknown number, I was hopeful it was a prospective employer. "Hello?" I answered. A familiar voice came from the other line. "Mark!" "Eddie? Eddie, you're finally out!" It was Eddie, and he was finally out. He had made it to the halfway house. He talked about how much he hated it there, how different the world is now, how scared he is, and so on. I just kept reassuring him and promised that I would come visit him soon. I really did want to see him. I was just uncomfortable bringing Haley into that kind of environment. I myself wasn't even sure what to expect. Only seconds later, after getting off the phone with Eddie, my phone rang again. I was really hoping this wasn't the beginning of him calling me every minute of the day for reassurance or whatever, as selfish as that sounded, but it was a different number than the one he had called me from. I answered the phone and it turned out to be a manager from Rizzy's Pizzeria, calling me for a job interview for a delivery driver position. It wasn't the best job that I had applied for, but I was happy just to get called back from anywhere. We scheduled an interview for the following day. Since I was already going to be going out by myself, I decided to call Eddie so I could come visit him. Maybe once he was out of the probationary period at the halfway house and was able to leave on his own, I would bring him over to my place so he could meet Haley then. I got dressed up the next morning and headed to my interview. I spent all night thinking about it the night before and tried to be prepared, and it ended up lasting maybe 5 minutes. The manager basically described the store and the job to me, asked me about my car and license, and then asked me when I was available to start. I went to Eddie's afterwards. He was telling me that he still wasn't happy at the house, but he knew he would adjust. He seemed very happy to see me though, and appeared to be in good spirits overall. I told him all about Haley and the new job. We talked about my mom and how the funeral went. I probably spent about an hour or so visiting with him until I had to go home. I told him I would come visit him again soon and would bring him to meet Haley once he was able to leave the house. Haley was proud of me for getting the job, even though it wasn't anything great. A couple days later, I went to my mandatory doctor's appointment and then headed to my first day of work. I actually ended up liking the job. I spent half my shift just driving around in my car, delivering food to customers. Most people tipped fairly well, and the work in the shop wasn't bad. Mostly just answering phones and making food. After about 2 weeks, I pretty much had everything down and was pretty comfortable at work. Things just kept going along, getting better and better. Rob even called back, and after another call to the attorney, I got us a date set up to go take care of the will. Friday finally came, but for me, that meant I had to work. Friday was our busiest day of the week. I was scheduled to close on this particular Friday, which meant that I wouldn't get off work until around 11:30. I told Haley that she didn't have to wait up for me, but she insisted. She said that she wanted to make me dinner, and was more than happy to wait until midnight to eat, if that meant that she would eat with me. That made me extremely happy and gave me something to look forward to during my entire shift. It must have been the quickest I had ever cleaned the store since working there. I told my manager goodnight and raced home. Haley didn't tell me what she was making for dinner. She said she wanted it to be a surprise. I told her anything but pizza would be fine. I finally made it home from the next town over and headed inside. Haley? I called out her name once I walked inside. I didn't smell any dinner or hear any cooking. I figured she must have fallen asleep waiting for me to get off work. She didn't usually stay up this late. I went to the bedroom to check on her, but she wasn't there. I looked around the rest of the house, but it seemed that she had left. I double-checked the driveway even though I know I'd seen her car when I got home, and sure enough, it was there. I called her cell phone, but she didn't answer. I walked back inside and sat down and tried thinking about where she could have gone. I decided to try calling her again. It kept ringing this time too, but then I heard something. I heard Haley's phone ringing from somewhere in the house. I took the phone away from my ear so I could hear where it was coming from. The ringing stopped once I got her voicemail, so I called her again, trying to identify where this ringing was coming from. As I was walking around through the house, my heart sank as I passed by the basement door. Once I was next to it, I could tell that the ringing was coming from down there. I tried to find a reason as to why she would have been down there, or why she didn't hear me come in, but in my heart, I knew something was wrong. I opened the door and began walking down the stairs, having flashbacks from what was originally created within my own mind. I placed my hand on the railing and walked slowly, as I was afraid of what I was going to see. And once I finally made it to the bottom of the stairs, my worst fears were realized. Haley, the girl that I loved, my one and only love, was gone. Just like what I had made up in my own mind in the past, she too hung from the ceiling. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It's like all emotion was sucked out of my body, and I just felt blank. I told myself this just had to be another delusion. Even after I felt the soreness on my arm from my most recent injection, I still told myself it was just a delusion. I walked up to her and looked at her. She was pale and felt cold. Then I noticed there was a note attached to her shirt. I suspected it was a suicide note. I pulled it from her and opened it. It only read, "Now your delusion is real. John's death won't be in vain. You took everything from me. Now I'm taking it back." Little by little, this started to become real, but I was still void of any real emotion. It almost felt like my life had been taken from me too, and I was certain that after a matter of time, it really would be. John's dad did this. He was obviously a very desperate man, a man that was willing to kill an innocent girl just to hurt me. There would be no coming back from this for him, and I was sure that he would be coming for me next. I knew at this point I needed to call the police, but I wasn't ready to let Haley go. I didn't want them to take her from me. But after some more time passed, I finally made the call. The police came. They took tons of pictures and collected all sorts of other evidence. Given my past, I was taken into custody and brought to the police station. I spent the night there, but told the police I had no involvement and explained my theory behind John Sr. and why he did this. I told them he replicated the death of the friend I'd made up in my mind, and that he was present during my trial and knew all the details to it. They were able to verify my alibi in the morning and let me go. They were treating my home as a crime scene by this point, and Haley's death had been listed as a murder. She had defensive wounds on her, and it was clear she tried getting out of the noose. I didn't want to go home anyway, and gladly got a hotel. I went to visit Eddie and told him about everything. He was heartbroken for me. I called my brother Rob, who felt the same way. They both told me they were there for me. I didn't feel like working, but told them I thought it was a good idea to keep myself busy. They both agreed. Eddie said to stop by as often as I wanted, and Rob said he would be in town soon enough. I spent the next few days finally beginning to mourn Haley as I realized this wasn't a dream I would wake up from, or a delusion that I would come out of. This was just life, as painful and as true as it is. The police called and said they had been looking for John Sr. to bring him in for questioning, but had been unable to locate him so far. I went into work that night, still reeling from the pain I was in. I was just hoping to distract myself any way I could. I spent most of the night doing work inside the shop, as it was a slow night. The ringing of the shop's phone broke the silence, and I ran up front to answer. To my surprise, and slight confusion, it was Eddie. "Eddie, is everything okay?" I said. "Yeah," he replied. "I knew you were working tonight, so we decided to have some pizza delivered since we're only a few miles from your work." It turned out to be a pretty pleasant surprise. I took his order down and began making it. Once it was done, I told my manager I'd be right back. I started driving to Eddie's house, and about halfway there, I noticed the same car had been following me. Any other time, I wouldn't be worried, but with John Sr. still not in police custody, I was on high alert. I told myself I was just being paranoid for that very reason and continued driving. The fear rose in me again as I pulled onto Eddie's street, and the car followed. I continued to Eddie's house and pulled in the driveway. The car kept driving and pulled in a driveway a few houses down. I realized that it must have just been a coincidence and breathed a sigh of relief. I grabbed the pizza bag and receipt and got out of the car. It was then, as I was walking up to Eddie's door, that I noticed the person from the car following me was walking towards me. It was when he stepped into the light I realized it was John Sr. He had a gun in his hand, and had followed me so he could finish the job. I just stood there. I was frozen. I knew there was nothing I could do. Just then, Eddie's door opened up, and he stepped out with cash in his hand, saying, "Took you long enough." Once Eddie looked at me, he knew something was wrong. That's when he noticed John Sr. standing there with the gun. John raised the gun towards me, and I closed my eyes and heard a shot ring out. Not being sure if I was still alive, I opened my eyes. Eddie was lying there right in front of me. He had literally taken a bullet for me. John looked panicked and ran back to his car, where he took off down the street. I knelt down next to Eddie. He was unconscious. "Hold on, Eddie. Help is coming," I said. I called 911 and told them what happened and that I thought my friend was dying. Just then I felt so much guilt for not visiting him every chance I got while he was still in Elmhurst, and not seeing him more often since he had been out. I stayed at the hospital with him all night, where he remained in critical condition. The police were now searching for John Sr. as a murder suspect, rather than a person of interest. He had killed, or at least hurt, the two people I had left that I was close to, and I wanted him to suffer. I knew that I needed to let the police do their job. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life locked up. I knew how awful it was, and I knew it would be way worse than anything that I could do to John Sr. anyway. Finally, the morning had come. I had to pick my brother up from the airport and go see the attorney to get an official copy of our mom's will. Seeing my brother was nice. He treated me better than the last time I saw him. I believe he felt sympathy for me, due to what I had just experienced over the last several days. The meeting with the attorney had gone as expected for the most part. The only thing that took me by surprise was a letter the attorney gave me. He told me that it was from my mom, and that she had asked him to give it to me after her death. I drove Rob and I to my house and went up into my bedroom. I sat down and opened the letter. It read, "Dear Mark, I first just want to say how proud I am of you. You've grown into such a great, loving young man. I know we already said our goodbyes, but there's one more thing I need to tell you. I'm sorry I didn't tell you this in person, but I just wasn't strong enough to do it. I know I always told you and your brother about your father dying shortly after you were born. Rob asked about him for a few months after he was gone, but because he was so young at the time, he eventually forgot all about him. But that isn't what really happened. Your father was very sick, Mark. Similar to how you're sick, but much, much worse. Back then, medicine hadn't progressed as far as it has recently, And due to many of the awful things he did, he was indefinitely admitted to the state psychiatric hospital. He was moved around from place to place, and we eventually lost contact together. At the beginning, his doctors told me he would never be released. They said he would always pose a danger to himself or others, and that he would die there. I'm not sure where he ended up in life, but I knew I wasn't able to tell you and your brothers the truth. I wanted you guys to have a chance, and knowing of your dad's condition and that he was going to die in an institution would only serve to hurt you both. If one day you decide to try to find him, that is a decision only you can make. He has a different last name than you two, as I switch our last names to my maiden name. Your original last name and father's current last name is Goodman. And if you ever decide to try to find him, his first name is Edward. I love you, Mark. Signed, Mom.
Hey, look who decided to finally wake up, I said. I'm alive? Eddie replied. No, heaven consists of you lying in a hospital with me sitting next to you, I said. Are you okay? He asked. Who the hell was that shot me? I'll explain all that to you soon, I promise. We just need to get you better. So what made you decide to take a bullet for me? I asked. It's complicated, he replied. I know, Eddie, I said. You know what? He asked. The look on my face told him everything. So, I said, how long did it take for you to figure everything out? I basically knew as soon as I saw you, he replied. Trying to quickly change the subject, Eddie said, I'm in a lot of pain. Can you go find me my nurse? As I was walking out of the room, Eddie stopped me. Mark, just so you know, I would have taken the bullet anyway. Just don't expect me to call you Dad, Eddie. I walked around and eventually found the nurse who had Eddie as her patient. While back in the room, Eddie asked me, So, did they catch the guy that shot me? John, you mean, I said. His name is John, and he's currently on the run still. I'm sure they'll catch him soon. Anyway, if you knew as soon as you saw me, why didn't you tell me? It's complicated, he replied. As soon as I was sent away, your mom eventually cut all contact off with me. I can't blame her. She even cut off my entire family, even your grandmother. That's why she never visited you in there. She knew nothing about you or where you were at. Well, I said, we just need to focus on getting you better and getting you out of here. I have to go to work, but I'll stop back in later. Work that night went by slower than ever and was pure torture. It was like I couldn't get Haley, Eddie, and John out of my mind. The police must have gotten so annoyed with me calling so often to see if they had caught John yet, or calling to ask what was taking them so long. You would think a man that killed an innocent girl and was an attempted murder suspect that was obviously armed would be a high priority. Once my shift at work finally came to an end, I went back to the hospital to check on Eddie. Although his condition was getting better and better, mentally he seemed in a bad place. Even worse, I had to be the bearer of bad news and let him know that they were still looking for John. I stayed with Eddie a bit and we talked. He told me he was sad that being stuck in the hospital was better than being at his halfway house, and how awful it was there. I told him I believe in him and he could get through it. He was tired, so I told him I was leaving and would come see him the next day before work. The next day I found myself lying to Eddie, telling him I had some errands to run before work and would stop by after work. The real reason I couldn't visit him before work was because I had to do some things behind Eddie's back. I started with the house manager at Eddie's halfway house and was referred to Eddie's caseworker. I explained to the caseworker that Eddie was my biological father and that I was left a big house all to myself after my mother had passed away, and that I felt it would be better for both myself and Eddie if he stayed with me after being released from the hospital. The caseworker didn't seem opposed to this, but told me it wasn't up to him, and that I would have to get an order from a judge. Luckily, the following day, there was a walk-in day scheduled at court. Although this was mostly for people that missed their court dates and things of that nature, I felt like it was at least a chance to get myself in front of a judge. I did end up in front of a judge the following day, but the judge said he didn't handle matters related to what I came in for. After being bounced around from person to person at the courthouse, I was finally able to schedule a court date with a magistrate the following Monday. I had several days to go before I would even have the opportunity to get this set up for Eddie, and I wasn't even sure how he was going to reply. We lived together for a long time and always enjoyed each other's company, but things were different now. Now that he knows that I know, he might look at things differently. Even if I'm able to get a magistrate to approve all of this, I still don't know what the result will be. And what if Eddie is released before my court date? I needed to calm myself down before I had a full-blown panic attack. I decided I would just take things as they come. I wasn't going to mention any of this to Eddie until after I see the magistrate. If by chance the idea excites him, I don't want to let him down if the magistrate declines my request. Over the next few days, I was doing nothing but constantly trying to juggle my life, going to work, visiting Eddie, looking into what's happened with John, and most of all, trying to keep my emotions in check. This life I'm living is still all so new to me. I've found love and lost it. I've lost my mom, and found out my best friend was my father after he took a bullet for me. There's a man out there with a gun who wants me dead, and the police still haven't been able to find him. Seriously, if I wasn't already crazy, all of this would get me there. When I went to visit Eddie Sunday evening, I found out that he was expected to be released from the hospital by Tuesday or Wednesday. This gave me a great sense of relief. Not only did it mean that Eddie was recovering well, but it gave me the opportunity to go to court prior to Eddie getting released. This night, Eddie finally demanded that I explain everything to him, and I did. He already knew a lot of the background information of what got me put into the institution to begin with, but none of the specifics of how and why it was boiling over into my, and now his, current life. I ended up talking about things a lot longer than I had hoped. Eddie was sent away when I was a baby and had no clue what my life was like up until then. He only knew my first name, but could still sense who I was when he met me. Everything in between, he was never given information to. I told him about my childhood, things that happened at school, how I suffered with my condition gradually getting worse, and the night that changed my life, and now the backlash from it that was happening as we spoke. The entire time I was speaking, Eddie looked like he wanted to tell me something, but all he did was ask me about my brother. Eddie had no contact with my older brother, and hadn't since he was just a few years old. Hell, I only had rather rare contact with him anymore myself. Between losing his dad, losing his mom, and even losing his brother for the most part, no one can blame him for moving away to start a new life. Eddie and I really began bonding in a new way from this point. Not so much in a father-son type way, but just a way that was different. I tried steering the conversation in a new direction at this point, and asked Eddie if he could tell me more about himself, specifically what his life was like when he was younger, and what got him sent away. The most I could get out of him were pretty vague statements. He again just told me he had made bad decisions, and that he was looked at as a danger to himself and those around him. But to be locked up for so many years, there has to be something more in particular, I said. Well, Mark, he replied, things aren't the way they are today. If you were looked at as being a crazy person a couple decades ago, the easiest solution was to just lock you up and throw away the key. Psychology and medication has really come a long way since then. I knew Eddie was right, and I began feeling both grateful and guilty at the same time. It was really late at this point, so I decided to say my goodbyes and head home. Monday morning came quick. I woke up before my alarm, and with an extreme sense of anxiety, scrambled to find my phone to make sure that I hadn't slept in. Luckily, I had only woken up early, not late. Between going to court and having John out on the loose, I wasn't getting the best sleep as it was. But I had to meet my own counselor before going to court, so waking up early was a relief when compared to sleeping in past my alarm. My own appointment was business as usual, and I raced over to the courthouse as soon as I could. Upon arriving, I navigated my way around the building until I was finally directed to the proper courtroom. Having to now finally just sit and wait, I began to grow more and more nervous. I started overthinking the entire situation. Even if things did go the way I wanted today, would Eddie actually want to move in? Would he be offended I did this behind his back? Would we still get along if we lived together outside of a controlled environment? I tried to erase all these thoughts from my mind and instead go over in my head what I wanted to say to the magistrate. I just needed to focus on doing what I think is best, and the rest will take care of itself, right? I looked around at how many other people were seated in the courtroom and started to realize just how long I might be sitting here in paranoia about what may or may not happen. To my relief, I was only the third person called to see the magistrate. I was asked to present the purpose why I was there. After giving the most compelling reasons I could as to why Eddie should be allowed to stay with me, and tell him how well we both have been doing for so long, the magistrate then read over something he had for several seconds, and simply granted my request. All of that preparation, fear, and anxiety that led up to this point was trumped in less than a minute by the magistrate quickly and easily giving me what I asked for. At this point, any fear I had of how Eddie might react vanished and was quickly replaced with relief and excitement. As soon as I obtained the paperwork I needed from the clerk, I left the courthouse and raced over to see Eddie. Once I got to Eddie's floor at the hospital, I started picturing myself walking into his room, only to find it empty. This morbid thought was gone as quickly as it started when I walked into his room, to find him sitting up in bed watching TV. "Hey Mark," he said. "Good news. The doctor was just in and told me I'm clear to go home tomorrow morning." "That's great, Eddie," I said. I actually want to talk to you about that." Eddie's expression changed to concern when he noticed the apprehension in my voice. "Eddie, I just got back from court. It wasn't for anything bad, and I hope this doesn't upset you or offend you." "Mark, just get to the point," he said. "Okay, I got an order that says you could come stay with me. I have this big house and I'm there alone. Plus I know you hate the halfway house. It's just an idea. You can do whatever you want." There was silence for a couple of moments. Eddie finally replied, "Are you serious?" "Yeah, but like I said, it's just an idea. You can't..." He cut me off again. "Mark, that's amazing. You're not just messing with me?" I was glad to be getting better, but I dreaded going back to that halfway house. "Yes, Eddie," I said. "I'm serious. I'm not messing with you. Tomorrow when you are discharged here, you can just leave with me and come back to stay at my house. We can go get the rest of your stuff from the halfway house whenever you feel up to it." Eddie, using more strength than he probably should have, grabbed my arm and pulled me in for a hug. "Thank you, Mark," he said. "You're welcome. It'll be good for both of us. Now, let's not rip your stitches out over it, though. I have to go to work soon. I'll be back tomorrow morning to come pick you up." I went home to relax for a bit and recover from everything that went on today. After a while, I headed into work. It went by much quicker this night, now that I wasn't consumed with the thoughts of what could go wrong. I was still worried about John being out there, but felt somewhat safe, due to doubting he would come back to this part of town to chase after me. He was being looked for by the police, and although he was able to hide up until this point, if he showed his face around the areas I frequented, he would be arrested shortly after. The next morning, I made sure to allow myself enough time to get to the hospital early so Eddie wouldn't have to wait around in the lobby for me. He said he felt well enough to go get the rest of his belongings from the halfway house, so we stopped there on our way home.
Eddie was pretty surprised at how big the house was that was left for me, and understood a little better why I didn't want to be there by myself. By the time we got Eddie's belongings inside, he needed to rest. While he laid in bed, I set up his room around him as he directed me into where to put what. It was comical at times, and once I was done, I felt like resting myself. For the next few days, things went great. Eddie mostly lounged around at home as he was still recovering from his wound, and I was more than happy to help him out in any way I could. He would occasionally mention how he felt bad that I was paying his way, but I continually reassured him that between my job, what my mom left for me, and the fact that he saved my life, I was more than happy with the arrangement. "You can get a job when you're feeling all the way better," I said. "Don't rush into it before you're ready, and take your time and find something you'll enjoy doing. It's been years since you've worked, so don't get overwhelmed." Eddie seemed satisfied with my reassurance and eventually stopped reminding me of the guilt he felt within our current situation. Our living situation was great overall, and Eddie and I continued building our relationship with one another and got along great. Things seemed so perfect that at times I would feel for the small lump in my arm just to make sure my medication was current and I wasn't imagining all of this. I had gone through so much turmoil in the small amount of time I'd been living back in normal society that it was difficult for me to process how things could be going so well. And then it happened. I didn't know it at first, but soon enough, I was back to being under attack. It started one day when Eddie and I were going to the store. While driving, I noticed that my brakes were feeling weird. The brake pedal would push down close to the floor, but I assumed I just needed a brake job, and it wasn't too noticeable, just gently stopping before pulling out of my driveway. As I arrived to the first stop sign on our commute, I had to actually press down on the brakes while going at a much faster pace. That's when I found out just how bad my brakes were. As I approached the intersection, I began to brake, but as I pressed down, I heard a popping sound. My foot went to the floor, and I quickly realized I had no brakes at all. In a complete panic, I told Eddie to hold on, and prayed no one would be coming through the intersection at the same time as us. But I wasn't so lucky. A car passed through right in front of us. I had no way to stop, and they were right in my path. Out of desperation, I cut the wheel to the right, running us off the road and into a small ditch. Luckily, we were only going about 30 miles per hour while approaching the intersection, but the impact was still pretty jarring. Once we came to the abrupt stop, I immediately directed my attention to Eddie. "Eddie, oh my god, are you okay? Is your wound okay?" I'm so sorry." "I'm okay," he replied. "What the hell just happened?" "I'm not sure. My brakes felt a bit weird pulling out of the driveway, and when I went to stop just now, it's like they just completely went out. I couldn't slow down at all." With neither of us being very hurt, we eventually calmed down and decided we would figure out how to handle this situation. Luckily, the AAA package my mom had purchased was still active, and I was on the account. After waiting for a while, a tow truck showed up and gave us a ride to the shop he brought my car to. This is when things went from feeling unlucky to feeling terrified. Eddie and I sat waiting as the mechanic lifted my car up and began to inspect the brakes. We watched as the mechanic called another man over to look at my car, and shortly after, he came over to me. He had a very concerned look on his face as he told me, "Well, I can tell you what's wrong with your car, and I'll be able to fix it, but unfortunately, it appears as if someone deliberately cut your brake line. You might want to contact the authorities about this." Eddie and I sat there stunned as we took in the information we were being told. We looked at each other, and I immediately said, "John." "Do you really think so?" Eddie replied. "Hasn't he been in hiding somewhere?" "Well, yeah, Eddie, he has, but who else would do this? There's literally no one else I could think of that would try something like this. And it isn't the first attempt he has made on my life. Not to mention, he's already killed before.
Part of me expected him to disappear forever, or at least until he was caught. But now I think he's trying to finish the job. Eddie and I sat in silence for a bit, both trying to wrap our heads around what was really going on. After my brakes were repaired, we headed over to the police station to make a report. I had hope that presenting the officer with something that had just happened earlier in the same day would spark a localized manhunt. Unfortunately, the officer just took down my information and thanked me. I pressed him on how serious this was and that I still felt like I was in danger. He assured me that they and other agencies were working hard on the case, but I still left the police station feeling much less hopeful than when I arrived. The officer also told me they would have a patrol car come down my street every so often to make sure everything appeared to be in order at my house. Eddie and I pulled into our driveway that evening once we finally made it home. "So, now what do we do?" I asked. "About what?" he replied. "About John," I continued. "The police obviously aren't doing enough. He's wanted for both murder and attempted murder, yet he's able to come back into town to try to attack me again? We need our own plan or form of protection." "Protection," Eddie laughed. "What exactly do you think the gun store would say when looking into either of our backgrounds?" "I don't mean a gun," I said, a bit annoyed at this point. "There are other options, even pepper spray or a bat or a knife. Anything would be better than nothing." "Look, Mark," Eddie replied, "we don't need to panic. The police are on top of this. We just aren't following them around and watching them work, so it seems like they're doing nothing. Also, we don't know for a fact that it's John behind this. It could have even just been a prank by some kids around here." I lost my cool at this point and snapped at Eddie. "First of all, don't do the whole 'look, Mark' thing to me, like you're my dad all of a sudden. And you can stay in your little world of delusion, but not all of us have been locked up in an institution the majority of our lives. There are real-world issues that you have to deal with out here." I could see the hurt on Eddie's face, and I regretted everything I said to him as the words were coming out. I got out of the car and began to walk inside. At this point, I wasn't mad at him, and I felt guilty for what I had said, but I didn't have the courage to face him and apologize. I stayed locked in my room that night and tried to forget about everything. How could I say something like that to Eddie? He literally took a bullet for me, and it wasn't his choice to stay out of my life all those years. I wanted to go talk to him, but instead, I lied in bed and eventually drifted off to sleep. Upon awakening the next morning, the thoughts of what had happened the day before came flooding back. I timidly walked downstairs after using the restroom to find Eddie at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and just staring out of the window. "Hey Eddie, look," he cut me off. "No, Mark, it's okay, you're right." "I wasn't right," I replied. "I was frustrated and angry and scared. I still am. I took it out on you, and that isn't fair. I'm really sorry." "Mark," he said, "I've thought more about what you said, and I think you're right. It's easier to deny that our lives are in danger, rather than worry about it and prepare. But if this really is John coming after you, we need to do something. I pray that the police will get to him first, but if he shows up here, we need to have a plan B." It was at that moment that I began to feel a little relief. I was still fearful of the overall situation, but at least I didn't have to face it alone. I sat down next to Eddie, and we began talking about all the actual practical ways we could face this potential situation. We decided first and foremost that we needed to safeguard the house better. We bought better locks for the doors and windows, and even alarms that would beep when a window was open. We figured if he did end up showing up here, the best case scenario would be making it as hard as possible to get in. As we already had discussed, neither of us were eligible to purchase a firearm, but we did manage to come up with pepper spray, a hunting knife, and a small taser. Once we had all of this finished, we did feel a bit better. A small part of me was hoping that John really was after me, or else I'd end up feeling pretty silly for doing all of this. But the larger part of me was hoping I would never see John again, at least not outside of a courtroom. A few days went by, and I began wondering if it was just my paranoia getting to me after all. But one night after work, any doubt I had vanished. Eddie was already in bed at this point. I had just gotten out of the shower and ready for bed myself. Lying in bed, I was mindlessly looking at things on my phone when I began to hear a clicking noise coming from somewhere. I couldn't identify what it was. I sat up in bed and remained completely silent as I tried to figure out exactly what I was hearing. My heart began racing. I dialed 911 on my phone, just so I had it ready to go in case I needed it. I slowly and quietly crept out of bed and inched my way towards the source of the noise with my phone still in my hand. I quickly remembered the other items I had purchased for self-defense and cursed myself for leaving them down in the kitchen. I got to the top of the stairs and was able to tell the clicking noise was coming from downstairs. Stepping on the very side of the stairs to limit any noise I made, I crept down step by step, basically holding my breath at this point. Before I could even make it quite halfway down the stairs, the silence was violently interrupted by the piercing sound of one of the window sensor alarms going off. I froze in place at the realization that the noise I was hearing was actually the result of another person. In a matter of maybe 2 seconds, the noise suddenly stopped, indicating that the window had been shut. I could hear obvious footsteps retreating from my property. This gave me a sense of relief, and I ran down the rest of the stairs to the window the noise had been coming from. Just seconds later, I heard Eddie coming down the hall from his room and heading down the stairs himself. It was dark outside of my property, and I found myself wishing I had installed motion detection floodlights, but even without them, I could see him moving quickly away from my property. There was no doubt in my mind that it was John, and he clearly hadn't given up the idea of ending my life. Luckily, the window alarm seemed to save us this time. Eddie was full of questions as to what just happened, and I filled him in on everything as I hit send on my phone to contact the police. Eddie was visibly shaken over this, which was the first time I had seen him show this kind of emotion since moving in. I knew he had believed me, at least to an extent, but I could tell it just got real for him. After explaining what just happened to the dispatcher, an officer came out to my house about 10 minutes later. He looked at the window and explored around other areas of my property, but despite what I told him, he said there was no indication that the lock on the window had been tampered with. I didn't see how this was possible, but didn't think it mattered anyway. I literally saw with my own eyes what happened and who was responsible. The officer made a report and told me to call again if anything else happens. He also told me that someone would call me the following day if there are any developments. I barely slept that night and must have checked the locks on everything 3 different times. Eventually, exhaustion caught up to me, and luckily I slept, even if it was just for a few hours. The following day, I waited around with my phone next to me, anticipating a call from the police. I assumed that with the new knowledge that John was in the immediate area, they must have set up a perimeter and finally found him. By the time 1 p.m. came, I got impatient and called the police station myself. I was hoping they had just forgotten to call me and update me on what was going on. After waiting on hold, I was finally put in contact with the officer that had been handling the case locally. I asked him if they had finally caught up with John, and his response was worse than I could have ever imagined. "Well, Mark," he said, "we've been looking into his whereabouts for a while now. Like I mentioned before, due to the severity of this case, other agencies have been involved in working on this case. Certain intelligence from one of the agencies is telling us that John ended up fleeing the country. We're not sure exactly where he's at now, but as far as we've been able to trace, it looks like he's headed to somewhere he can hide out at and not be extradited. So as far as he goes, you're safe. You don't need to worry about him anymore. And if he ever returns, which is doubtful, we will know about it." You can always call us if you ever feel you're in danger, but you don't need to worry about him anymore. He's been gone for a while, so that wasn't him. You're safe." I was absolutely shocked when he told me this. I knew what I saw the night before, and I tried telling him that their so-called intelligence had gotten this wrong, but he kept assuring me they hadn't. I could eventually begin to tell that he was patronizing me and treating me like I was just some paranoid crazy person, and that's when I lost hope. Yes, my mental illness is real and documented, but it's also being treated and has been for a while. It's even part of my probation deal that I don't walk around delusional anymore. I hung up the phone and knew right at that moment I was on my own. I explained the conversation I had with the officer to Eddie, and he once again became hopeful. Maybe it was just a random person and John actually was gone, he suggested. But I told him that wasn't the case. I saw John, and I was positive it was him. I don't know whether or not Eddie truly believed me, but he at least decided he would entertain the idea and act like he did. I was even more on edge about the situation at this point. I felt like John was going to come strike at us again at any moment, and I no longer had the reassurance that the police would take me serious and help me if I called them. I had to do this on my own, and that scared me. Eddie started talking to me about what type of plan we could come up with, but I told him I wanted him to stay out of it. I didn't want him getting hurt again because of me. He continued to insist that I let him help. I knew he was worried for me like I was for him, but he still wasn't even fully recovered from the last time he encountered John. I was trying to develop a rational plan. More than anything, I just wanted to move far, far away. The only way I would actually be able to do that would require selling my house first, and although it could be done, it wouldn't happen fast enough. Eddie and I decided to stay at a hotel the next couple nights while I figured out a more long-term plan. This of course wasn't the cheapest option and wasn't something we could do for long, but it at least gave me a small amount of peace for the time being and allowed me to finally sleep. Our second night at the hotel, I had to go to work, and Eddie had planned to stop back at our house to grab a few items we were going to need. The night went fine for me, but once I was done at work, I checked my phone and saw that I had a voicemail from a phone number I didn't recognize. My blood ran cold when I heard the voice of a nurse from our local hospital, letting me know Eddie was there and asking me to call them back. In a panic, I got in my car and began racing to the hospital as I tried calling back the number. I got bounced around a bit on the phone, and eventually I was able to speak with the nurse that had called me a bit earlier. She told me that Eddie was being treated for non-life-threatening injuries, but that I needed to get to the hospital as soon as possible. I attempted to gather more information, but she insisted that I would be filled in on everything once I arrived. Minutes later, I made it to the ER, where I was directed to Eddie's room. When I walked in, Eddie was lying in the bed as the nurse changed the dressing for his wounds. Obviously frantic and wanting to know what was going on, Eddie explained it to me. Earlier in the night, he went back to our house as planned. As he was walking up the stairs to our door, he tripped over a wire. This wire turned out to be attached to a shotgun, and tripping over the wire made it fire. Luckily for Eddie, the wire also tripped him and made him fall down. Therefore, he was only grazed on his shoulder and upper arm. Still a decent amount of damage was done, but nothing at all life-threatening. I would like to say I was shocked when I heard this, but I wasn't. I was expecting something like this to happen. I was expecting it enough to get us a room for the time being. I knew in my heart two things. John was still in the area, and he was going to keep coming at me until one of us were dead. The police had already visited Eddie in the hospital before I arrived, but as the homeowner, they requested that I stop by the station to provide a statement. I left the hospital to go to the police station, telling Eddie to call me once he was discharged later in the night. On the drive there, I was stuck in this awful feeling of guilt for Eddie, who was now in even more pain on my behalf. If nothing else, I needed to at least keep him safe for now on. I thought that maybe it would be best if he wasn't around me until all this was resolved. If nothing else, I was holding on to a bit of hope that some good could come out of what happened tonight. Maybe the police would begin to take my theory on this more seriously. Upon arriving at the station, I was brought back so I could sit down with an officer. He asked me some general questions, and I explained to him that I knew for sure it was John that was after me, and Eddie was just unlucky. But as soon as I brought John up again, any hope I had was shattered. I was once again met with a reply that John had left the country. The officer told me they would continue to look into this, and overall, this further proved I was truly on my own. On the drive back to the hospital to get Eddie, I couldn't help but think the police weren't being honest with me. At one point, John was an extremely successful and wealthy man, and he had friends in high places. As of now, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a level of corruption going on. I knew there was still people holding a bias against me in this town. I was the crazy guy that killed the perfect, successful model student, at least in their eyes. Eddie was waiting for me by the time I made it back to the hospital. On the drive back to our room, I could tell he was doing his best to stay positive about everything, but I knew he was scared. Eddie went to bed as soon as we got back, and once I received a call from the police letting me know they checked my property out and it was clear, I decided I would go get the things that Eddie and I needed. Although I was tired, I figured it would be the best time to go. The drive there wasn't a long one, as we were staying pretty close by, but I began getting a bad feeling once I was nearing my property. I didn't see or hear anyone, but something just felt off. I tried telling myself it was just paranoia from what has been going on, but I was unable to shake the feeling. I turned my headlights off as soon as I turned onto my street, and parked a bit down the road so I could approach my house safely and undetected. There wasn't much I had to carry back to my car anyway. I walked down the street as quietly as possible and crept through the yards to eliminate footsteps. I figured I was probably just being silly, but after everything that has happened, I didn't want to take any unnecessary risks. Upon reaching my property, I still didn't see anyone and began feeling more comfortable. But maybe 2 seconds later, I was stopped dead in my tracks. It was dark, but I saw a shadowy figure come around the corner of my house. I immediately got down and tried being quiet while I observed this individual. He was going around to every window, looking into each one for several seconds until moving on to the next. Once he neared the front of my house, enough light from the street illuminated him to the point where I could see it was John. I knew he was looking for me. Everyone knew that he completely melted down after his son died. It was obvious he's obsessed with the idea of killing me and doesn't care about anything else. I remained quiet, waiting to see what he was going to do next, but the silence was broken when my neighbor's dog began barking. I was about to panic. I continued watching John, and the dog appeared to scare him as much as it did me. He began looking around and slowly started backing away from my house. He headed through my backyard into the woods. I knew that this was my only chance to find out where he was staying. I maintained what I thought to be a safe distance and followed him into the woods. I made sure to be as quiet as possible, paying close attention to my surroundings so I didn't trip over anything or step on something that would create any unnecessary noise. After 10 minutes of this, I realized that my phone could give me away if someone called. Although I didn't expect anyone to get a hold of me at this time of night, I couldn't risk being killed over my cell phone. I briefly stopped walking and knelt down. I pulled out my phone and quickly put it on silent. Once I got back up, I found out that doing this nearly blinded me to the darkness around me. I tried regaining any night vision I could muster, but realized I had lost sight of John. I kept moving in the direction I last saw him heading, but was extra cautious. The last thing I wanted to do was accidentally walk past where John was at, completely exposing myself. I was shaking at this point. Every step I took felt like it was going to be my last. Finally, I heard some noise in the distance. I headed in that direction for a minute, until finally regaining sight of John. He was headed into what looked like an abandoned shack of some sort. I crept closer to get a better look, still maintaining a safe distance. It appeared he had made a few small renovations to the place, just to make it more inhabitable. I circled around the structure a bit, but wasn't able to get a look inside to see what he was doing. It didn't matter though. I managed to locate where he was staying, and could now bring an end to this nightmare. I spent the next 30 minutes navigating my way out of the woods and to my house, constantly looking over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed. I finally made it back to my property, and it looked like I was in the clear. I approached my house slowly, looking for any potential traps that might have been set up. Everything appeared to be clear, so I made my way inside and quickly grabbed what Eddie and I needed before heading back to our hotel room. When I arrived, Eddie was still asleep. Regardless of how exhausted I was, I knew I still needed to call the police to report John's location immediately. By the time I made the call, it was after 8 a.m., so I was able to be directed to the officer assigned to my case. "Hey Mark, how's everything going?" he asked after picking up the line. "Well, I have some good news," I said. "I went home to get a few things earlier this morning and found John on my property. I followed him about a mile into the woods and found out where he's been staying. I know where he's at. You guys can finally go pick him up." Hello? I was met with only silence for a few moments. "Mark," the officer finally replied, "we've been over this. Regardless of what you think you see or what you think is going on, it's not. John isn't here. He wasn't on your property earlier. He's not even in the country right now. I'm sympathetic to what you've been going through, but you can't keep using our resources here to go on a wild goose chase. I can't keep dropping what I'm doing every time you call just to repeat the same thing to you. I'm sorry, Mark, but you can't keep calling about someone that isn't even here. If you keep it up, you're going to end up in trouble. Just drop it, Mark. Do yourself a favor and drop it." I couldn't believe it. Even with hard proof available, they just won't pursue John no matter what. I could probably hand deliver him to the police station and they would still deny it's him. I hung up the phone without saying anything more. If the police weren't going to go after John, then I would. I couldn't allow Eddie and I to just sit around, waiting for John to attack us next. I didn't want to tell Eddie about all of this, as I didn't want him getting involved. But I also knew if I went after John, it might be the last time I even see Eddie, so I owed it to him to let him know what was going on. I gathered up the few supplies I could bring with me, a knife, pepper spray, a flashlight, etc. I figured if I could catch John off guard and hit him with a pepper spray, I could probably finish the job with a knife. Even with that being the best case scenario, I was fully aware of how much trouble I could get in. But with the reported attacks on Eddie, and the fact that John's a wanted murderer, I could surely come up with a solid defense. Either way, I felt like it was either this, or Eddie and I were going to end up dead. Once I told Eddie the plan I had in mind, he was less than happy about it. He spent some time trying to talk me out of it, and once that didn't work, he told me he was coming with me. Of course, I wasn't allowing that to happen. Once I explained my reasoning for everything, he seemed to understand. He still didn't like my idea, but he at least wasn't trying to stand in my way. Staying up all night was actually working in my favor. By the time I'd be going to sleep, I wouldn't wake up until around midnight. That way, I should be able to catch John off guard. With my nerves practically on fire and thoughts racing through my mind, falling asleep seemed almost impossible. But after enough time, exhaustion caught up and won. I woke up that night to an intense level of anxiety, like something had startled me awake.
I looked around. It was mostly dark in our room, and I noticed that Eddie was asleep in his bed. Everything else was quiet. I then realized that it was a dream that had woke me up. I couldn't remember what the dream was actually about. I just had that sense that I could tell it happened. I checked the time and it was 11 p.m. This would give me some time to make sure I was completely ready and head over. I planned on parking at the same spot as the night before and making the trip on foot. I felt confident I could find where John was staying, even in the dark. There was a part of me that kept trying to talk myself out of going, but I just reminded myself that it was either this or waiting for John to kill me. I couldn't live with that constant fear, and I especially couldn't live with myself if I chickened out and Eddie died because of it. I planned on waiting until around 3 a.m. or so before heading over. I wanted the best chance possible of catching John while he was asleep. Once it was close for being time to leave, Eddie woke up. He again tried talking me out of going, but he quickly let up once I reassured him my mind was made up. He told me he wanted to come with me. At first, I again told him no, but he said he only wanted to stay at our house while I went. He said that way he could eventually call the police if I didn't come back after so long. I made him promise he would stay in the house and keep the doors locked, and he did make that promise, along with reminding me he could barely lift one of his arms anyway, and he had no interest in hiking through the woods at night. "We leave in 10 minutes, I told him. He nodded and walked away to begin getting ready. The drive over to our house was both silent and tense. Eddie and I quietly walked up to our house. He pulled me in and gave me a hug. We looked at each other for a moment, and I was off. I followed the same path as last time to the best of my ability. It was much darker than I'd remembered. My progress was slow as I was trying to be as silent as possible and had a hard time seeing where I was going. I ended up walking, if you want to call it that, for a few hours and still hadn't managed to find John's shack. The sun began to rise, and although I was grateful for the light, I was also upset I would be arriving to my destination later than planned. These woods went on for miles, and if you walked far enough, it became easy to get lost. I slowed my progress down even more as the light began piercing through the trees. I was trying to get my bearings and figure out which way to head next. Moving as slowly as I did, it was difficult to estimate how far I walked, but I continued on anyway, and somehow, I eventually ended up seeing the shack in the distance. I checked my phone and it was nearly 10 a.m. at this point. I was hours off my goal, but I'd come this far and I wasn't backing down now. I slowly approached the structure. Once I was within 20 feet of it or so, I began to move only inches at a time. I couldn't hear any sound or movement coming from within the structure. I circled it a few times, trying to find a way to see anything inside, but there was no way to look in. I still heard nothing and hoped that John was asleep. I made my way to the door and opened it as quietly as possible, with my pepper spray in hand. It creaked quite a bit, so I decided to just throw it open as I launched my surprise attack. But it was empty. John wasn't here, and I began to wonder if this was just a temporary place he stayed for a night. Maybe I had no clue where he was after all. I began looking around the shack and quickly discovered it looked pretty well lived in. Based on the bed he put together and the food and hygiene items, someone was definitely living here. I started looking through his items, seeing if I could find anything that would lead me to any plans he had or his current whereabouts. I was moving fast and my heart was racing even just being here. I decided my best bet would be to hide out near the shack and wait for John to come back. I would launch my attack whenever that was and he wouldn't see it coming. I got my phone out to text Eddie. I'd been sending him text messages periodically, letting him know that I was fine. I tried sending him another one now, but I realized I no longer had service. It was okay though, I didn't need it. I had a plan, and I was going to wait as long as it took to execute it. I made my way back out of the shack, and then it felt like I was struck by lightning.
The next thing I remember, I was struggling to get back to my feet. My ears were ringing, and I had a throbbing headache. I began to panic as I realized that this was no coincidence. John had caught me. As my vision began to clear, I looked up to see John above me. He had a smile on his face and was holding a bloodied baseball bat. It was at that point I could feel wetness running down my cheek and onto my neck. I was hit pretty hard, enough to cause bleeding, and I knew at that moment I blacked out for at least a second. Before I could get to my feet, John shoved me back to the ground. "Just stay down and don't make this harder on yourself," he said. He raised the baseball bat in the air as he prepared to swing it at me again. I managed to finally get my pepper spray out of my pocket and shot it in the direction of John's face. He screamed in pain, and I again began getting to my feet. I only made it a few steps before he grabbed the back of my collar and threw me to the ground. Just like his son, he was bigger and stronger than me, but I was going to fight, not only for my life, but for Eddie and Haley's as well. He began striking me in the back of the head with his fists. I was able to get up to one knee and quickly spun my body around, getting away from his grip. I ended up on my back and began kicking upwards towards his face as hard as I could. He dove towards me and I landed a hard kick to his jaw. He came down hard on top of me and knocked the wind out of me. I was praying he fell down unconscious, but I wasn't so lucky. I again tried squirming away, but I was pinned. He began hitting me over and over to the point I nearly passed out. Once he could tell I was pretty incapacitated, he finally got up. As I lied on the ground, he said, "I told you I could make this easy, but you didn't want that. It could have already been over for you. It's okay though, it's better this way. Do you remember this?" I looked up and John was holding a pocket knife in front of my face. It was my pocket knife, the one I used to kill his son that night. "Yeah," he continued, "I thought you would recognize it. A buddy of mine at the police station got it out of evidence for me. I wanted it because it was the perfect way to serve actual justice to you. Not that bullshit stay at the hospital that the judge thought was punishment. And I'm going to put it right in your neck. An eye for an eye." "Then do it," I said. "Punish me for killing your son. Your stuck-up, undeserving, idiotic bully of a son. Even with a clear, lucid mind, there hasn't been a day I've ever regretted ending his pathetic life. And I'm sure I saved others the misfortune of ever meeting that prick. And apparently, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree after all. So, just do it." John began walking towards me slowly, with a knife in his hand. He had a new look of rage on his face. As he got to only a few feet from me, I closed my eyes, and I waited for it to be over. The next thing I knew, I heard a loud, metallic sound fill the air around me, and I felt a large mass falling on me. Again, it was John, but as I struggled to get out from underneath him, I realized he wasn't moving. I quickly looked up and saw a figure, holding the baseball bat that John had originally used to hit me with. Still being in a daze, I had to squint my eyes to make out who it was. My heart nearly stopped as I felt around for my injection site, making sure I was still properly medicated. "Ricky?" I said, barely getting the word out. "Mark," he replied. "Are you okay?" I was still struggling for words. This isn't real. What has really been going on in my life? Who are you?" "Mark, it's me," he said. I'm real. I'm actually real." "But how? Why?" I asked. Right at that moment, both of us directed our attention to John. He was beginning to breathe loud, gasping breaths. His head wound was obviously way more serious than mine, and then he appeared to stop breathing altogether. "Shit," Ricky said. I didn't mean to kill him, but I couldn't let my twin brother die." "What? What do you mean, twin brother? What the hell does any of this mean?" "Mark, you can trust me. I'm real." No, I said. I can't trust you. That's what's wrong with me. I don't know what is real. Okay, he said. Let me explain. I just met our dad, Eddie. Well, it was the first time I met him that I can actually remember. When we were born, Eddie was mentally ill. He thought I was the devil for some reason or something, and you were the pure one. Obviously that wasn't true, but in his mind it was. So he ended up trying to kill me a few times. My adoptive parents told me about this a few years back. Eventually, he tried drowning me in the bathtub when we were still just babies. He was locked up for that. Our biological mom divorced him and changed our last names. She was still concerned he would get out of prison and come for me, so she put me up for adoption. When our mom died, I found out about it. That's when I found out I had brothers too. And when I found out I had a fraternal twin, I had to find you. I tracked down the address and came to your house earlier this morning. Eddie was there, and when I introduced myself as your brother, he let me in and told me everything about what's been going on in both your lives since I was given away. And like I said, I wasn't going to let my twin brother die before I really even got to meet him. Eddie said you told him the shack was about a mile off your backyard. It wasn't too hard to find. I just stared at him in disbelief, continuing to check my injection site so I could verify for myself this wasn't just a delusion. My life changed in more ways than I could possibly imagine in just a second. Our mom covered up my existence the best she could. She didn't want you to be affected by all this. Eddie was cut off too. He spent almost an hour telling me the story, but everything is okay now. He told me that the police were even doubting this guy was even in the country. Wait, this is the guy, right? Yeah, Ricky, it is, I replied. How did I know your name then? I asked. Ricky shrugged his shoulders. Probably ingrained from our mom saying it so much when we were babies. Plus, twins have a lot of weird twin stuff anyway, who knows? Ricky walked over a few steps and grabbed his phone off a fallen tree. He played with it for a second and then handed it to me. A video was playing, and it showed everything. It showed John coming after me with a knife, and Ricky saving me. Ricky said he did this to protect both of us, especially once he learned that I suspected corruption at the police department. Corruption that John himself seemed to verify. Ricky helped me through the woods and back to my house, as I was still quite a bit beat up. I was hospitalized for a night, and a police investigation was launched in regards to John's death. The police immediately began to accuse Ricky and I of conspiring together to kill John, but luckily Ricky's video quickly exonerated us. Eddie and I both fully recovered from our wounds, at least the physical ones. We're still medicated and living our lives, but things are good. We've been living together for a while now, and our friendship has never been stronger. I even met another girl, and things with her are great. Ricky lives a state over, but we still talk almost every day, and we see each other in person about once a month. There's been a lot of horror and trauma throughout my life, but when I go to sleep at night, I get to close my eyes and think back to that poor boy at school, and I get to smile knowing that Ricky and I have finally beaten the bully.